The main thrust of this program is to question the validity of the official record of mankind's exploration of the moon. Sending men to the moon and bringing them back safely is widely held to be the greatest technical achievement of mankind so far. The greatest achievement of the second millennium. But this story of Project Apollo presents an alternative viewpoint. The material you will see uncovers numerous inconsistencies in the official NASA record of manned missions to the moon. The anomalies presented bring into total question whether, over the period of 3 years from 1969, 12 named Apollo astronauts really did travel through deep space and walk upon the surface of our celestial neighbor, the moon. New evidence throws into serious doubt the authenticity of the Apollo record and suggests that NASA hoaxed the photographs taken on the surface of the moon. This aspect of the lunar photography is dealt with in Part 1. In Part 2, we will be looking at the dangers of space radiation that have to be overcome when journeying to and from the moon. And in Part 3, we examine the evolution of the rockets involved and the problems of getting astronauts and all their equipment out to the moon and back, alive and well. This production is the result of painstaking and extensive research. You will hear the testimony of many people from various disciplines, including those who can be described as whistleblowers. These are individuals who have spoken out or left a legacy of clues. In a 1959 report to the U.S. House of Representatives, rocket engineer Wernher von Braun stated that manned orbit of the moon would not occur before 1969, and that a manned lunar landing would only follow years later. The NASA administrators and their contractors, North American Aviation, were firmly of the opinion that until at least the early 1970s, only unmanned instrumentation would be probing the lunar surface and its environment.
In 1959, I was working with advanced research at Rocketdyne, and they did a study on the statistical probability of landing a man on the moon and returning him, and it was something like 0.0014. This was taking into account the Van Allen radiation belt, solar flares, micrometeorites, all of the numerous hazards that astronauts would encounter and the possibility of failure. So obviously, when I heard that in 1959, I pretty much got the idea that going to the moon was a real risky thing.
Despite these and other expert opinions, 2 years later, President Kennedy officially set America on the road to the moon. Given the fully acknowledged relatively primitive state of 1960s technology, we are going to investigate the dramatic progress and the many claims made by the Apollo space program.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
This program will show that real live astronauts were sent on the high-risk journey to the moon, but they were not the now famous named astronauts who in all probability never left Earth orbit. In this way, they avoided exposure to the hazardous and even lethal radiation of deep space by remaining below the zones of radiation that encircle Earth, and of course staying well within the Earth's magnetic field, which contributes to the protection of our planet. Even in our present state of technology at the dawn of this new millennium, potentially lethal radiation awaits all those who venture through the Van Allen radiation belts into deep space, whether they be en route to the moon, to Mars, or beyond. So did Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Ed Mitchell, and their named comrades sacrifice their personal integrity on the altar of NASA's reputation? Did other unnamed astronauts sacrifice their lives? And if so, for what reason? Was it to cover for the fact that in the late 60s it was not possible to guarantee the safe return to Earth of the Apollo astronauts? Such a scenario would answer that inevitable question, why? and to justify the serious anomalies in the official record which this investigation reveals. Dr. Ian Crawford is a research astronomer for the Department of Physics and Astronomy at University College London.
In our history, we've messed up a lot of things, but we have also done some things which are truly great, like building the pyramids, like building the cathedrals in medieval Europe, and like putting people on the moon in the 1960s. I mean, these were tremendous achievements for their time.
Could it be the case that NASA publicly stated that it was doing things one way, when in fact plans were in place to proceed in a very different manner? Was it realized very early on that apart from the unpredictable radiation hazards and the massive technological challenges, the lunar environment itself, without an atmosphere and certainly no winds, created yet another set of insurmountable problems?
Maybe it'll, that sort of looks like it's waving in a breeze. Yes, sir.
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Yes. Like many of us, David Percy was overjoyed at the sight of Armstrong apparently stepping onto the lunar surface in July 1969. David is an award-winning film and television producer, as well as a professional photographer and associate of the Royal Photographic Society.
A representative of mankind may well have gone to the moon in 1969, but our research suggests that images of the Apollo landings are not a true and accurate record of such an event. In our view, the Apollo pictures were faked. Many were also encoded with deliberate mistakes. In the years following the Apollo missions, it became increasingly clear to us that there were also errors in the continuity between the live TV coverage and the still photographs. Many of the images are replete with inconsistencies and anomalies. These anomalies and errors may well have been deliberately introduced by whistleblowers. The view of co-author Mary Bennett and myself is that these whistleblowers were individuals deeply unhappy with the fraud they were perpetrating. They in all likelihood created the errors in the anticipation that one day these mistakes would be discovered and exposed. Now, back in the Apollo days, in order to record the original broadcast material for posterity, it had to be filmed off TV screens during the live enactment of each Apollo mission. Now, following the recently completed transfer of all that film onto videotape, it's now been possible to study this film in its entirety, something, incidentally, that relatively few people have done. And furthermore, there's added irony in the fact that new evidence suggests that the original broadcast material wasn't live at all, but actually consisted of pre-recorded video programming. We've come full circle.
Talk us through an example or two of errors in continuity between the Apollo TV coverage and still photographs of the same event.
A serious continuity error can be found in the last but one mission, Apollo 16 of 1972. Let's take a look at a clear discrepancy in the record. We've dubbed this the jump salute. When the astronaut reaches the peak of his jump, his colleague takes a snap with the Hasselblad stills camera. Let's ignore the reasons as to why such a small jump in the much reduced 1/6 gravity of the moon, and continue instead with the discontinuities revealed by these images. This is the resulting Hasselblad photograph of that event. The most significant difference between these two images of the same action is that in the still photo there's a triangle of fabric that should be absolutely secure and motionless that has flapped up from the top of the plis, the personal life support system, as the astronaut jumps into the air. In the TB freeze frame we can see this triangular flap is correctly fastened and is therefore not visible. It's not flapped up. If it had done so, it would be very obvious in this rear view, the TV image. You can see the size and detail of the triangular flap from this view of the top of the plis. How could this part of the vital life support pack not be correctly fastened in place on a real Apollo situation on the moon? In any event, actions taking place simultaneously, such as TV and stills photography of the same event and the same time, must show the same detail. Both versions cannot be correct. In other words, this piece of TV footage and this still picture cannot possibly have been taken at the same time. This is, in our view, a designer continuity error that cannot have occurred by mistake. The triangular flap would have had to have been intentionally unfastened and hinged upwards and secured in an open position to be visible from the front, as is recorded in the still photograph. Our second example is from Apollo 11 on their way to the moon, when the craft is allegedly 130,000 miles away from the Earth. This anomalous sequence was also found by a fellow TV producer and Apollo researcher, Bart Sibrel. We're all familiar with the way X-ray pictures are clipped up for examination against the light box. Well, what I'm about to show you is a sequence with a large colour transparency of the Earth clipped up against the window. If I put white behind it, you can see that more clearly. And when it's clipped up against the window, it becomes illuminated by the light of the sun behind it.
Okay, 11, we have a picture. We see the Earth right in the center of the screen, over.
The astronauts are assured that F22 is the correct exposure.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out. And we'll zoom our camera in slowly.
Here is what appears to be the Apollo 11 crew's view of the Earth across the blackness of space.
Roger.
But why did the choice be made to take this all-important first view of Earth from 130,000 miles out by standing well back, away from the window?
Could you describe what you're looking at, over? Roger, you're seeing Earth as we see it at our left-hand window, just a little more than a half Earth.
During the sequence, after the camera has zoomed in, surprisingly, something comes between the camera and the Earth, partly obscuring the view. Obviously, this could not happen if they were shooting directly out of the window. It would not then be possible for anything to get midway between the camera and the Earth.
Central America. South America becomes invisible just off beyond the terminator or inside the shadow.
And now in this wider view, there's also an interior light in the shot. How can that possibly happen? Well, in fact, all that we've just been looking at was televised live from the craft. But the camera was not looking out through the window at all. Had they been filming the real Earth from a position back from the window, it would be difficult to keep the subject well framed, as you can see from this illustration. The Earth in the far distance would be cut off by the window in the foreground when any movement of the camera occurred. We've ringed the edge of the window white for clarity. Remember, it was handheld. And if they had been filming the real Earth when zoomed in, the edge of the window would not be sharp. It would be out of focus like this and spoil the shot, because the focus would have been set at infinity. Far better to have gone right up to the window and filmed from there.
It's floodlight.
Returning to the sequence where we left off, when the lights have been switched on, the other window shade opened and the exposure adjusted, we can see astronaut Mike Collins. The left-hand window we've just been looking at is now overexposed, but as we get closer, we can see that something is indeed clipped in front of the window. Is it that window-size colour transparency of the Earth, with the sunlight glowing white behind it? It looks very much so. Why would they need to be videoing a picture of the Earth?
Maybe a cigarette stop might help.
Continuing with the shot, we panned around past Armstrong, who is in the centre of frame, across to the right-hand side of the capsule. And here, would you believe, through the right-hand window is what appears to be the real Earth filling the view. From the Apollo 11 command module, the CSM, we're being shown two different views of Earth, but both cannot be correct. Given that the first version is purporting to be over halfway to the moon, and on closer examination is seen to be a colour transparency, we have to conclude that this image is not a true representation of the CSM's position. However, the time recorder reads out a mission elapsed time of 34 hours and 16 minutes.
34 hours, 16 minutes, and 15 seconds. Right, can you see that clearly enough, Charlie?
Where could they be? Well, as the second view of Earth fills the craft's window, we must conclude that they're in the relative safety of low Earth orbit, and not on their way to the moon at all. That would then explain why they were videoing a picture of the distant Earth. It's worth noting that this star chart, which is obviously clipped to the window, is held there in the same manner as we suggest was the backlit transparency of the Earth we saw earlier.
The President's two star charts that he is using right now as sunshades over the right-hand window, window number 5. Right there, we see the sun shining in through it behind him. And
this sequence, then, together with the jump salute, are our first two examples of whistleblowing fakery and indications to us that something's seriously wrong with the Apollo record.
Dr. David Groves is a physicist in the UK and a specialist in image processing.
I've been involved in image analysis for 25 years now. I did my PhD developing holographic computer techniques for analyzing images. My company, Quantic Image Processing, use these image processing techniques to extract three-dimensional information from two-dimensional images used in industry and used in medicine. The NASA pictures that I've analyzed contain many inconsistencies, a whole core of which have no rational explanation or excuse.
Not surprisingly, a growing number of intelligent thinking people are beginning to realize that all was not well with Apollo. So why aren't professionals in the aerospace industry speaking out? What could be the reason for such reticence? Well, in fact, some have spoken out. Bill Wood lives in California. He is a highly qualified scientist with degrees in mathematics, physics, and chemistry. He's been granted high security clearance for a number of top-secret US government projects. Wood has worked with many major contractors to the United States government, including McDonnell Douglas, and also with engineers employed on the Saturn V, the Apollo launch vehicle. For many years, Bill Wood has harbored suspicions regarding the authenticity of the Apollo record.
I think that a lot of the people that I have had contact with in the aerospace industry want desperately to believe that this actually happened, because it's a source of pride that their profession contributed to an achievement like this. And then, of course, within the United States, we're all very proud that our country made this achievement. So there's a real reluctance to question anything that would destroy this lofty self-image. And particularly for the people who worked on the Apollo program, to many of them this was the most wonderful achievement that they ever produced during their entire life. And they would much rather think of it that way than to think that, like millions of other people, they were fooled into thinking they were working on something that was not genuine.
I think the idea that the Apollo project was faked is demonstrably ridiculous. I think it can be demonstrated that this is the case from a large amount of evidence, both scientific and indeed just common sense.
H.J.P. Arnold is an astronomer and very keen photographer, an expert on space and astrophotography. He was assistant to the managing director of Kodak Limited during the period of Apollo. He's also the author of many books on space photography and exploration.
This is a roll of, as you can see, 70mm film, and this is, of course, I hasten to say it's not the original, which is in the closely guarded and temperature and pressure controlled vaults in Houston, magazine 40 from Apollo 11. So this is the roll of Ektachrome film that was exposed mainly by Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface, and of course it's a historical record, but I do stress that this is a duplicate which was given to me, and I'm very proud to have been given it by the people at the Photographic Technology Division in Houston.
Brian Welch is Acting Director, Media Services at NASA Washington.
The film was specially produced for NASA by Kodak. It involved the use of thin gels and special emulsions for this film. The idea was that it would have to stand up to a vacuum, it would have to stand up to extremes of heat and cold on the surface of the moon.
But H.J.P. Arnold has a completely different view regarding the film used.
It was Kodak film, and the sensitization of the film was essentially the same as ordinary film at that time. It was Ektachrome X, as it was then called, 64 ASA, or ISO, as we need to say now. ASA is all gone. Or 160, which was then a very fast film, of course, at 160 ASA or ISO.
So it turns out that the film emulsion was perfectly ordinary after all. Then perhaps the camera itself was special. Hasselblad in Sweden was the NASA-appointed manufacturer of a camera capable of functioning on the lunar surface, and Jan Lundberg was the project engineer responsible for building the camera.
Originally, NASA made all the alterations themselves. Then they presented what they had done to us and asked, can you do this? And we said, yes, we can, and we can do it better. So after that we put up a technical specification which was approved by NASA, and then all the alterations were made in our factory.
Was the film loaded into a regular camera magazine?
It was a modified standard 70mm back. There were protective plates both on the camera and on the film magazine.
On all the NASA still photographs taken by the Hasselblad lunar surface camera, one should see small crosses spread at intervals over the surface of the image. In the center of the image, there should be a larger crosshair, or reticle as it's called professionally. These reticles were virtually in contact with the film and set in the focal plane of the camera at the time of manufacture by Zeiss. This means they are removable. Any photograph purporting to be taken on the moon by the named Apollo astronauts using these lunar surface cameras must feature the large reticle at the center of the picture. Not only that, it would be totally impossible for an object to get in front of the reticle on the developed image.
So what exactly are these reticles or crosshairs for? What do they do?
They can measure the distance between the crosses and also determine if the film has curved, because then the crosses will be slightly dislocated.
So what is NASA's opinion on the reason for the reticles?
Those are there in those photographs in order to provide the engineers with the ability to measure distances. They would knowing the way the photo was put together, they would be able to use that to measure things off in the distance, and so that's why they're there.
Did the reticles also help to judge distances?
Not actually.
Because that's what NASA says the reticles are for.
Well, to do that you need a stereo pair.
However, the Apollo pictures, those with the reticles, were not taken as stereo pairs. Let us now look at some further basic photographic principles and examine some more of the Apollo photographs to see what anomalies might come to light.
In these Earth pictures of typical tree shadows, notice the parallel lines of shadow on the ground, and also that the shaded side of the trees is very dark, which does not allow for any visible detail. These points are both logical and unsurprising. Now compare the tree shadow pictures with this shot allegedly taken on the moon. This is the designated landing site of Apollo 14. The area where the LEM is located is virtually flat. But one can calculate from the diverging shadows that the source of the illumination is within the area of the scene itself, apparently overhead. In other words, it cannot be the sun. It's possible to work out exactly where the light source was positioned, because the shadows diverge from a point here, when in fact the shadows ought to be parallel. The sun creates parallel shadows. The shadows cast by the rocks in the foreground should have been east-west, like the LEM shadow here. When natural sunlight is illuminating objects on flat terrain, this result is impossible, but this result is consistent with illumination from a closely positioned artificial source of light.
Should we then take this matter of artificial lighting very seriously?
Yes, because according to the official record, no artificial lighting whatsoever was taken to the moon. Compare NASA's photograph with our computer-simulated image. The light source, the sun, in our simulation is located far to the west, the left-hand side of your screen. And in our illustration, all the shadows are falling, naturally, due east. We must therefore irrefutably conclude that an artificial light source was used in close proximity to this alleged moon location in order for NASA to obtain the non-parallel shadows seen here in this photograph. Let's go through some more examples. Here is a Honda press advertisement that's used a very interesting mix of shadow directions. For the sake of argument, let us take it that the cars were the primary subject of the photograph, So they were the beneficiaries of the prime source of natural light, the sun. And the very, very short shadows created by the cars themselves indicate that these were photographed near to midday. The sun's direction is from the bottom right-hand corner. The palm trees, however, have been photographed when the sun was further round, nearer to setting, and therefore creating these very long shadows due to the sun's closeness to the horizon. This is an example of a composite picture containing two differing sets of shadows, a composite that incorporates the message that there have been time delays between the components that make up the final result. For Honda's purposes, this discrepancy doesn't matter. But to see the same type of composite manifesting in the official record of Apollo is more than enough to alert us to the fact that something's very wrong.
Can you then give an example of this from an Apollo mission?
Yes. Crossing to Apollo 17, here is a picture of Jack Schmitt digging. His shadow is extending in the same direction as that of the cars we've just been looking at. The source of light is from the bottom right-hand corner of this picture. Yet if we look towards the right of the scene, we can see that the shadows of the middle distance rocks themselves run from east to west, shown here by the green lines, the secondary light source. The yellow lines indicate the direction of the primary light source, allegedly the sun. Now this situation is impossible naturally, and has to be the result of more than one light source and/or technical manipulation and doctoring of the image. If we look at the shadows of the rover's wheels in this photo, we can see that they are somewhat diverging, as shown here by the lines, and as we tilt down we can see that this rock here, halfway down the picture on the right-hand side, is producing a shadow that extends diagonally to the lower part of the picture, as is the shadow for the foreground rock. The rock with the letter C marked on it, originally noticed by fellow researcher Ralph Rene. Let's pause here for a moment and ask why there should be a letter of the English alphabet stamped onto a rock on the moon's surface, and why there's a C also marked on the ground just in front of this very peculiar looking rock. How could this be? Surely we're looking at the deliberate planting of props on a previously designated portion in the foreground of a photographic film set. Does this planted C stand for center, or is it perhaps C for light, artificial or otherwise? For this is the letter that represents the physical constant of the speed of light as it's presently understood. If early probe images from the moon had demonstrated that natural lighting conditions there would not reproduce consistently acceptable results due to the gravitational anomalies and possible variations in the behavior of light, the subsequent use of artificial lighting in the pre-creation of the lunar surface imagery makes a lot of sense, as does this whistleblowing clue.
The fact that the speed of light may not be a constant is only just beginning to be discussed openly beyond scientific circles, but of course variations of light speed at specific periods have been observed over the years. It could well be that the speed of light varies according to local gravity fields.
Coming back to shadow anomalies, here is an example of a Mongolian herdsman, photographed with the light behind him. And of course, if a photographer is exposing for this scene, he or she knows perfectly well that without the use of fill-in flash or other lighting near the camera, there's going to be a result that looks more like a silhouette. Now look at this picture of an astronaut spacesuit, which was taken in a studio. The prime or key light is from the right, the upper area of the picture, and the area by the shoulder, here on the left, is much darker. So parts of the subject have been filled in with light in order to give us more detail. And indeed this fill-in light is square in shape and has been reflected by the visor. We propose that this technique of using extra fill-in light was applied when certain Apollo close-ups were created. Here we have the sun, allegedly the only lighting source available to all lunar photographers, directly behind the astronaut and directly behind the rover. And remembering our example of the Mongolian herdsman, with no extra lighting and no atmosphere to help diffuse the light and fill in the subject, we must expect the authentic lunar surface picture to look like this, with both the astronaut and the rover in silhouette. Yet in this NASA moon photograph, as published, we can see detail on the shadow side of the astronaut. To say this once more, such detail can only be revealed by the use of an additional light source. So we have to conclude that secondary lighting was used to create these alleged lunar surface pictures.
Were any lights used in the lunar surface photographs?
No. They had no extra light sources brought with them.
At this point, let's consider some of the important initial imagery allegedly taken on the surface of the moon by the Apollo 11 astronauts. Another individual named Bill Wood, working at Goldstone Tracking Station in California, played an important role throughout Project Apollo in delivering the communication links to and from the spacecraft. What were conditions like on the lunar surface at the time of the Apollo 11 moonwalk, or EVA? And if it was so dark in the shadow of the lunar module, the LEM, did they, for instance, use a special low-light lens on the camera?
Astronauts would go down the ladder essentially in deep shadow. They would only be illuminated by something reflecting off of, light reflecting off of something else. And I believe that they felt that they needed as much light gathering power as possible. That was the lens that was used on Apollo 11, the so-called night lens.
If the Apollo 11 TV footage was taken using a night lens, then what about the still photographs? We have to ask how they produce such good results, because the stills camera was not specifically designed for low light conditions, and the camera was not fitted with a special night lens.
In the moon, where you have no atmosphere, shadow is black and highlight is really violet highlight, so you have an enormous contrast problem.
We're reliably informed, to emphasize this point again, that no extra lighting was taken to the moon. We've taken the TV coverage and intercut the relevant still pictures.
Okay, your bliss looks like it's clear and okay. But those are about to come over the sill.
This is the first of a sequence of photographs of Aldrin descending the ladder, taken by Neil Armstrong during Apollo 11.
Now drop your bliss down. There you go, you're clear.
A number of sources, as well as the many reference books on the subject, emphasize that the shadow side of the LEM was in total darkness, and this fact is also confirmed by the TV coverage itself. You could call it designer gloom in comparison with the still photos. In this still picture sequence, Aldrin is apparently lit. In other words, an artificial light source has turned what would otherwise have been unusable, gloomy pictures into images of virtual studio-like quality.
Visibility, as we've said before, is not too great. Okay, I'm on the top step and I can look down over the RCU and landing gear pad. Okay, I'm going to leave that 1 foot up there and both hands down about the 4th rung up.
So here we have Aldrin, descending the ladder in total shadow. But we have evidence of the use of artificial lighting in the still photos of the event, because we can see that lighting is hitting part of the porch, the backpack, part of Aldrin's spacesuit. And most notably, it is hitting the heel protector of his right boot. It is obvious to anyone who understands photography that secondary lighting was used in this image. The reflectivity of the lunar surface, incidentally, is so low that it doesn't even manage to illuminate the rocks on the surface near to the ground. So we cannot accept the argument that the astronauts are beautifully lit even into the porch area of the LEM due to lunar surface reflectivity.
I think the idea that the Apollo photographs were faked is extremely unlikely. I think you have to remember there were 6 successful manned Apollo landings. So the idea, if something had gone wrong in the first one, then of course it would be pretty simple to fix it for the other ones. The other thing you have to remember is, although there are 2 or 3 perhaps really famous photographs from the Apollo project that most people are familiar with, really tens of thousands of photographic images were obtained from the surface of the moon during those missions. So the idea that they were all faked really seems pretty unlikely. And to be honest, it's extremely difficult to fake those photographs, because the environmental conditions on the moon are really different from the environmental conditions on the Earth, or even different from the environmental conditions you could easily duplicate in a studio.
David Groves of Quantec Image Processing, using the technological resources at his command, has traced this secondary light source and been able to calculate exactly where an additional light was placed in relation to the camera.
If you magnify the photograph and look at the boundary of the porch through which the astronaut is exiting, you can see a fine shadow line around the porch perimeter. This shadow line shows that you have a well-localized source of light to the right of the camera. Most interestingly, there is a hot spot on the heel protector of the astronaut's right-hand boot. This allows us to do some quantitative measurement. We had access to one of these boots with a heel protector from which we could measure very accurately the curvature of that heel protector, knowing again the focal length of the camera lens, the position of that hotspot on the heel protector, and the orientation of the boot in the photograph. We could determine the light path to that source of illumination. The light source is between 24 and 36 centimeters to the right of the camera, an ideal position for artificial lighting.
So it's now been established beyond argument that an artificial light source was used. We even know where it was placed for the photography of this important sequence of Aldrin descending the ladder. At this point you might say, well, surely they can use extra lighting if they want to. What's wrong with that?
According to NASA, the astronauts didn't take any lighting to the moon, and we can prove that there was no lighting. The TV coverage of this event demonstrates this fact. In the TV footage, we can see Armstrong standing at the foot of the ladder as Aldrin descends, supposedly taking the still photos which are the official record of this event. Aldrin is in darkness. Aldrin is not lit. Yet the published still photo sequence clearly indicates the use of an artificial light source. Did Armstrong really take these still photos during Aldrin's descent on the moon? In our opinion, probably not. We propose that this is a completely restaged, or rather pre-staged, set of studio photographs.
So, wherever the Aldrin descending the ladder sequence of stills was taken, an artificial source of light was deployed.
I know that they had no extra lighting, no flashes or things like that. So it has to be the reflection from the surface.
That the astronaut will be adequately lit whilst in the shadow side of the LEM solely from natural light or earthshine bouncing off the lunar surface is an argument advanced by others as well as Jan Lundberg, but it's untenable. To make a direct comparison, the surface of the moon on average has the ability to reflect light from any source whatsoever at whatever distance from its surface to the same degree as asphalt does on Earth, on average approximately 7%. In other words, whatever the strength of the light arriving on the lunar surface, whether by natural or other means, the ability of the average lunar surface to reflect light remains constant. Indeed, the lunar surface luminosity is so low it doesn't even manage to illuminate the shadow side of the smallest rocks, as we've already seen. Here's another good example. The sun, or prime light source, is behind the LEM. This picture is taken into the light, so the side of the craft nearest to us should be absolutely black, but has been filled in with a generous amount of light. Particularly obvious is this piece of equipment illuminated from the front.
That sequence of images on the lunar surface, taken mainly by Armstrong, of course, on that with that one camera, which was incidentally left on the moon, so it's going to be a marvellous relic for when we eventually get back there, of course. The film came back. That film, probably, I would say, has never ever been bettered, whether on the moon or subsequently. Almost every one of those relatively small number of images taken by Armstrong appeared to be splendidly composed. You remember the classic face-on picture of Aldrin with his visor reflecting the entire landing scene, the lunar module, the flag, the TV camera, and Armstrong taking the picture reflected in the visor. It's a marvellous picture.
With that comment, H.J.P. Arnold has led us to another of the classic Apollo 11 images. In fact, one could say that this particular shot conveys the very essence of the entire Apollo program. Yet this classic picture of Aldrin has several very serious problems.
Aldrin cannot be standing in natural sunlight in this image because the surface around him is not evenly lit, as would be the case with light from the sun. This scene is obviously lit with uneven artificial lighting. The prime source of light is over Aldrin's left shoulder. The light is emanating from this direction. We know this is so because we can see what photographers call fall-off in the top left, the top right, and the left foreground. This fall-off effect is the name given to darker areas caused by lighting a subject with a non-uniform source of light. lighting that does not have enough spread, as this false colour version particularly reveals. Secondly, we can see that our old friend the fill-in light has again been used to illuminate the suit detail on Aldrin's right-hand side, the left of the picture.
On the face of it, there doesn't seem to be anything particularly strange about this image to me. The sun is over behind the guy's left shoulder. He's casting an image, a shadow moving to bottom left, as you would expect. The astronaut himself, you can see, because of although he's not in direct sunlight, the direct sun is on his back. He's being illuminated by reflected light from the foreground.
Remember, our claim is that the fill light is artificial. The camera position itself is also in doubt, for we seem to be looking down on the astronaut. How can we tell if that's so? Well, recalling the large centre reticle cannot be anywhere but in the centre of the image, we're surprised to find that this reticle is over the lower part of Aldrin's right leg. The Hasselblad camera was attached to the astronaut's chest at the time, and so the centre of the image should be over the abdominal area of the subject. This lower leg position for the centre reticle strongly indicates that the camera was in fact positioned at a higher level. As this graphic demonstrates, the centre of the picture can only be over the subject's lower leg if the camera is positioned at eye level and then tilted down. The camera height and tilt angle was calculated by David Groves. This fact represents another serious problem. The reflection of this scene mirrored in the astronaut's visor shows the astrophotographer with his camera clearly positioned at chest level, which actually cannot be. So this false reflection must have been composited or painted in over the original image. The reflection we see in the visor cannot be that of the photographer of the image.
The horizon is a very good datum. On the moon, the horizon effectively acts as a spirit level. We know it's about 89 degrees from the true vertical. Therefore, the position of the horizon cutting through the image of the astronaut shows us the level of the camera when the picture was taken. And if we look at the picture, we can see the horizon cuts very nicely at face level.
And as for the orientation of where the astronaut was, I mean, the moon's surface isn't completely flat. He may well be standing there with with his camera at chest level, and the guy being photographed may be a couple of feet lower down because the ground slopes.
The camera taking the photograph could have been positioned on the chest of an astronaut, and that astronaut could have been about 2 foot higher than the astronaut that was being photographed. To this end, we could analyze the shadow in the image. Basically, the information we have and can make use of is we know the width of the visor in the image, the focal length of the lens used on the camera. Using that information, we can analyze the shadow of the astronaut's left leg and determine between the two astronauts the variation in height of the surface. The variation in height of the surface between the astronauts is typically a few inches. It would have to actually be 2 feet to explain the incorrect positioning of the camera when the image was taken.
I'll be honest with you, I think that's pseudo-scientific, nitpicky claptrap. And again, I don't know why we should spend even a moment trying to judge that.
But as we've seen, there are indeed crucial problems with the photographs. This is the point. The so-described nitpicky, pseudo-scientific claptrap is not pseudo at all. The analysis has been undertaken based on the laws of physics. Fortunately, the information encrypted within these images has survived the voyage across 3 decades and is now being decoded by people like Percy and Groves. The proof is in the detail. It may be uncomfortable for NASA to accept that the warning whistles of these unknown photographic encoders are at long last now being heard.
By the way, the Apollo 11 high camera examples are not isolated ones. Here's a picture of Al Bean of Apollo 12, also taken from too high a camera position. The camera is looking down on the subject, belying the reflection in the visor. Notice the horizon passing right through the center of the visor. There are further examples from Apollo 11 where the camera position is even higher than that in the classic shot. Here we see Aldrin standing by the LEM with the horizon not cutting through his visor at all, but passing above the height of his helmet. indicating that the camera position was even higher than that of the picture of Albine and the classic photograph itself. Some people have said perhaps they retouched the pictures to bring up the detail of the astronauts, but any retouching of images cannot apply to Apollo 11 pictures. We've examined a duplicate or copy of the roll of film from magazine 40 that purports to come from Armstrong's camera. It's a roll with well over 100 coloured images. Retouched or publicity pictures cannot get into a continuous roll of film. So none of these images can have been retouched unless they've been collectively rephotographed onto a continuous roll under entirely different technical conditions than we've been led to believe.
So what does Hasselblad have to say about this classic Aldrin picture? Does it look to Jan Lundberg as though the subject was lit?
Yes, it seems like he's standing in the spotlight. And I can't explain that. That escapes me. Why? So maybe you have to find Armstrong and ask him.
The most compelling piece of evidence in this photograph is not the measurements of the height of the camera, but the reticles, the little crosses that are superimposed on the image at the time the photograph is taken. The largest reticle appears at the center. That central position is fixed in the camera. It cannot move. You have to have, with an image it hasn't been interfered with in any way, that reticule appearing in the center of the image. If we look at this famous photograph, we can see the central reticule towards the bottom of the astronaut's right leg. This is significantly offset from the center of the image. This cannot occur in that position unless the photograph has been copied and reframed.
I don't think this cross here necessarily does indicate the center of the photograph. There's another cross over here, there's another cross over there, and in fact NASA photographs you often see have fiducial crosses all over the place to help them orientate themselves.
Why is the center reticle not in the center of the image?
The exact answer to the question is I don't really know and haven't even bothered to go find out. And the reason is this is 30-year-old stuff. We mounted this expedition, the expeditions to the moon, almost 30 years ago. And frankly, I had a chance to look over the points that this person was making. I didn't understand them. I don't understand why we should spend the time to go off and do the research to look up, to prove to people that we went to the moon. The fact of the matter is we did go to the moon.
While noting that Brian Welch referred to one single expedition to the moon and then corrected himself, it's interesting that NASA, via its media representative, declares itself not accountable to the public for its actions. This despite the fact that NASA went to the moon for all mankind. And surely the fact that one individual spokesman claims he doesn't understand the questions asked does not in any way invalidate the demand for a proper response and the necessity for a proper response.
The effort involved in trying to fake, one image might not be too bad, but in trying to fake thousands and thousands to assure that you were never discovered over 25 years seems completely implausible to me. It seems a bizarre thing to question something that is so demonstrably part of history just by trying to interpret 2 or 3 photographs when the project was so much deeper than that and affected so many people in so many ways.
This establishment view, albeit not held by everyone, misses the point entirely and is not a reason for ignoring these disturbing findings. The quantity of suspect pictures is not the real issue, it's what these images convey. These pictures have been presented to the entire world as authentic and actual photographs of this most significant event, mankind's first steps onto a planet other than his home. To ignore or dismiss the questions raised by the discovery of even one technically defective photograph purporting to be a part of this official record is to sidestep the issue. However, we'd like to offer the upholders of this status quo viewpoint yet another major challenge. In Western Australia, during the live telecast of Apollo 11 in 1969, many viewers in that region of Australia, including Una Ronald, were to have an extraordinary experience.
When this moon landing was in the offing, I for one decided to stay up to watch the live telecast, and I did, and we saw a lot of activity on the television screen from the control center, a lot of anticipation, a lot of excitement.
But before we get to what happens next, we need to know how the TV coverage of Apollo 11 was supposed to have reached our screens.
Just shortly before Armstrong stepped on the moon, you can actually see the switch take place where it goes from this stark black and white to a little better. And they stayed with the television signal from Honeysuckle Creek. So when Armstrong stepped on the surface of the moon, it actually came through Australia, but at the time it was reported as being through Goldstone. The voice came through Goldstone, but the TV pictures came from Australia.
It appears that correct information was apparently withheld at the time as to what was supposed to be happening with Apollo 11's reception.
As I watched this person walking, a Coke bottle in the lower right quadrant of the screen, it seemed to be kicked over and rolled across. And for me that was just astounding, and I exclaimed aloud at the time, "It's a fake, it's a setup, they're not on the moon at all, look at this, it's a Coke bottle." And they were going to broadcast the same film again in the morning, and I phoned several of my friends, "Do you watch, and they hadn't. But they were going to watch in the morning. And I waited, of course, to say, "Well, did you see it?" But it didn't happen. I watched the second telecast. There was no Coke bottle, which led me to believe at the time that it must have been edited out. I was convinced it was fake, but why? Why it should be faked? Why such a setup? 2 or 3 others of my acquaintance did see it. And furthermore, there were letters written to the West Australian newspaper. They mentioned the Coke bottle. And I waited for it to brew up. I thought, my goodness, there's going to be a glorious ding-dong here going on about this Coke bottle. But suddenly there was nothing at all. And I presume that those who saw it denied their own senses, as people will do. Began to think, well, they couldn't have seen it, or perhaps it was there and that was okay. They'd thrown some rubbish out of the spacecraft or something like that. It could have been. People will invent all kinds of solutions to what is not explained.
What Una Ronald and her friends did not know was that Western Australia was a special case concerning the reception of the initial Apollo images. Contrary to the procedure for that continent set up by Honeysuckle Creek and Parkes, together with NASA and Australian TV, the Apollo 11 images were neither sent directly to Western Australia via satellite, nor was there a broadband link from Sydney in 1969. These images had to be sent over to Perth from Sydney by other means and then retransmitted locally. So for an engineer in the loop, aware of the hoaxed live TV coverage, there was motive for adding further additions to the scene. Moreover, here was an opportunity for someone in the know to manipulate the material before transmission across Western Australia. Bill Kaysing is a science writer and was head of technical publications in the Propulsion Field Labs in California from 1956 to 1963. He was employed by Rocketdyne, contractors to NASA who built the Saturn V rocket and the command and service module.
I was very much in on testing and edited and wrote technical reports on testing and, of course, witness tests.
So what is Bill Kaysing's view of what actually happened during Apollo?
As I see it, NASA and other connected agencies knew that they couldn't get to the moon and back. All right, they had to simulate it. So to do this, they went to, say, agencies like ARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency in Massachusetts. They're connected with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I have worked for ARPA, and I know that they have the highest level scientists. So NASA and NSA and other assorted agencies went to MIT and said, okay, this is a super secret project, tell us how we can simulate it. to create a simulation is really not all that difficult, because if all the input comes from NASA and goes to NASA, and you knew that was the case, all Apollo communications were handled from and to NASA, so they had complete control.
Once the astronauts had been launched, it was no longer possible to verify the authenticity of any communication. In the case of major news stories here on Earth, journalists witness and comment on news events, and reports have to be confirmed before going to press. The Apollo communication links were controlled by none other than NASA itself. In these circumstances, how could we know for sure that the images from NASA were those of events that were actually occurring at that moment? Given the unique distribution method reserved for this region of Australia, was that Coke bottle incident a very discreet marker on the official record, a blow on the whistle that at the time would go undetected by Houston? What was really involved in the lunar surface photography? How would the Apollo pictures be taken by the astrophotographers?
Typically, they either had a table of settings for certain subjects at certain sun angles, or it was usually presented as a wheel or a circle, a clock face if you like, where for a given shutter speed they would have a series of apertures around the sides of the dial instead of 1, 2, 3 o'clock, etc.
But how were the necessary adjustments made so they could be sure of obtaining the correct exposures?
They had a lot of practice so they could feel what the setting was, because once on the moon, on the lunar surface, in the dress, in the life support system, you couldn't see the camera. They couldn't bend their head that far down to see the scales. Maybe they could see the aperture scale, which was in the front, but not the rest. They had no viewfinder. They had to aim by moving their body.
They had to effectively guess where they were pointing the camera, but since they were using a wide-angle lens on the lunar surface, it wasn't really too much of a guess, because broadly pointing the camera fixed to their chest in the direction they would encompass the subject in which they were interested.
I'm going to run off a couple, John.
Needed where the sun is shining on what they want to see.
Houston has that field of view.
Our own research has ascertained that composing pictures under these conditions and getting the camera pointing in the right direction isn't actually that easy.
Neil, this is Houston. The field of view is okay. We'd like you to aim it a little bit more to the right, over.
Here, the TV camera couldn't be lined up on the Apollo 11 LEM without assistance from base.
Okay, that's all the cable.
Even with Houston's essential guidance, lining up the camera is obviously very difficult to achieve.
I'll start working on the shoulder. A little bit too much to the right. Can you bring it back left about 4 or 5 degrees? Roger, you look okay as far as distance goes, Neil, and we'll line you up again when you finish the panorama. You're going too fast on the panorama sweep. You're going to have to stop for a final orientation. We'd like it to come left about 5 degrees, over.
So we wonder how they managed to take such good, well-composed, studio-quality pictures using the Lunar Hasselblad without a viewfinder and without Houston to guide them when lining up the camera.
Back to the right about half as much. Okay. Okay, that looks good there, Neil.
Was it intended that they should change lenses, filters and magazines outside, with the potential of dropping them into the dust, rendering them unusable?
So once they went out, they had one set for this particular mission, and then they went back in, changed whatever they needed to change, for instance film magazines or lenses, and then they went out again.
Okay, Houston, I'm going to change lenses on you. Roger, Neil.
But going inside each time is not what actually happened. These operations took place outside the LEM.
Okay, Houston, tell me, get a new picture. Neil, this is Houston. That's affirmative. We're getting a new picture. You can tell it's a longer focal length lens.
think they got to rush through what we've got.
Okay, magazine Delta is working, and I'm starting with frame count number, about 1. Okay.
There was always a problem with these things, remember, because they were wearing these very awkward gauntlets.
These already difficult manipulations of the camera equipment would have been made even more difficult due to the astronauts' heavy pressurized gauntlets, like this and this. Wearing these pressurized gauntlets, it would have been virtually impossible to bend the fingers and grab hold of a magazine slide, change lenses or whatever else. There were no oversized tabs on the camera to make adjustments, and only normal size scales.
The gloves were built that they couldn't grip anything smaller than about an inch. They had very bad feeling on the fingertips.
Were these thimble-tipped pressurized gloves, or rather gauntlets, actually the ones used? In the TV footage, these gauntlets looked totally unpressurized and more like sturdy gardening gloves. Using unpressurized gardening-type gloves would explain how the astronauts in the TV coverage managed to manipulate the Hasselblad and imaging equipment.
And even supposing that their gloved fingers dealt efficiently with these technicalities, remembering that the Apollo 11 moonwalk was very brief and that the Hasselblad actually had no viewfinder, how did they manage to get such professionally composed pictures? Pictures that resemble the classic pack shots we see created by the top advertising agencies.
Here we're into the realms of the seeing eye. Undoubtedly, there were some of the astronauts who, despite all of the pressures on them, and the fact you're wearing a helmet and a visor and you can't look through a nice screen or viewfinder at all, could see a picture when it occurred to them.
This picture from Apollo 15 can only be described as a good example of a typical advertising pack shot. Everything is perfectly arranged to sell the product. In this instance, that product is NASA's program. We have the astronaut filled in with light, so we don't get a rather disappointing and ghastly silhouette. He's standing just adjacent to the American flag, beautifully backlit and glowing, planted so that it slightly overlaps the lem, thus leading the eye across the picture. And of course the lem just happens to be photographed in such a way that its promotional logo is towards the camera. The rover itself then slightly overlaps the lem, delivering altogether an excellently composed picture, in no way consistent with the mere snapshot of random objects. Such an excellent image would be ideal for future use as general publicity, and in fact was used subsequently for posters and postcards. This is emphatically not a casual photograph of a saluting astro colleague who just happened to be standing, as luck would have it, in the right place at the right moment. This is a planned setup, in our view, and would have taken a highly professional photographer several hours to get right in the fully equipped environment of a studio. Now let's look at some more inconsistencies in the shadows present in the Apollo imagery. We're going to consider the shadow allegedly produced by Armstrong when collecting a contingency sample. The sun angle should have been just over 10 degrees above the horizon during this action. Compare that image with this Apollo 12 scene. Here the shadow is much longer than Armstrong's, but as the sun was at a higher angle of 15 to 16 degrees during their EVA, the shadow in this picture should actually be shorter than Armstrong's, had these pictures been taken, as claimed, in natural sunlight on the moon. In this TV coverage of Apollo 14, the astronaut is moving away from the camera, the thin pole shadow in the foreground. As he progresses towards his colleague, watch his shadows do some really strange things.
Q bay door is open. Pulled a little stiffer than I expected in 16G.
Looking good though, Ed, and you all are within 9 minutes of the timeline.
These variations in shadow length are consistent with moving away from, or nearer to, a large superlight, placed close to the subject, as we'll show in a moment. Here again is Apollo 11. This time it's Armstrong and Aldrin standing together. But their two shadows grow to completely different lengths. The nearer one of them moves towards the light source, the longer their shadow becomes. Such an effect has nothing to do with their relative heights and everything to do with moving to and from a superlight. Remember, the landing site was supposed to have been on flat terrain, the Sea of Tranquility. Consider carefully the difference in lengths of these two shadows. To show that this effect is consistent with moving towards or away from an artificial light source, here is a demonstration we set up in our London studio. This increase in shadow length cannot occur in natural sunlight on a flat surface. Note also in this scene the position of the American flag. We know from the official record that the astronauts did not touch the flag again once erected. We also know that this flag was artificially supported along the top in order to give it substance in the airless and motionless lunar environment. Now look at this flag, later in the same mission. How can it be that the top edge of the flag is now supported from the mast at a totally different and increased angle, unless it was unofficially altered on the set?
Could these two differing flag positions from Apollo 11 be a form of semaphore signalled to us by whistleblowers? Once again, here is the message of the passage of time, symbolized by erect and drooping flags. Undoubtedly, there would have been serious repercussions for future manned space travel if the named astronauts were to die or to be seriously irradiated on the moon.
Discontinuity involving flag setups wasn't restricted to Apollo 11. As you can see in this footage from Apollo 16, the US flag is being taken out of the LEM before the TV camera pans around to the right to follow the astronaut as he proceeds to the site chosen for the all-important erection of the flag. As the camera continues its pan round to the right, we should expect to see the astronaut fixing the pole into the ground and adjusting the stiffened flag to its most attractive angle. However, when we get there, the flag has already been planted and the astronaut is leaving the scene. You can see his shadow in the bottom right as he departs from the frame. Truly a giant leap for all mankind, for in order to carry out this task, the astronaut has had to arrive at the location, select the most likely soft spot in a totally unknown surface, hammer in the lower part of the flag mast, insert the upper part of the mast and its attached flag, perhaps adjust the folds, and only then remove himself from the scene. All this while wearing the most cumbersome of gear, a pressurized spacesuit and the PLIS, the life-supporting backpack. According to this piece of footage, Apollo 16 achieved this list of things to do in a mere 69 seconds. A mere 69 seconds. This is the setting for the famous jump salute we analysed previously, with its designer continuity error.
There's that picture, which I'm sure many people will have seen, of an astronaut, I think it's Jack Schmitt as I recall, with the US flag sloping because of the wide angle effect of the lens somewhat, pointing towards the Earth, which is at the point of the triangle. Now that is an extremely well-observed image.
What's that? I want to get the Earth. Oh, okay. Let me get over on this side. I don't think it's gonna... They're a little close, maybe. Have them both in focus. That might do her.
This picture is supposedly the outcome, the instant when the camera clicked. Remembering that there was no viewfinder, how was the photographer sure of including the Earth, the essential element in this photo? But that is not our prime gripe with this example. The flag itself is the giveaway. The loudest whistle blow is in the manner in which the flag's been adjusted. We can see quite clearly in this still image that the edge of the US flag is billowing positive, that is, bulging towards the stills camera. And therefore, the edge of the flag should be billowing negative or bulging away from the TV camera. Yet when we view the TV coverage, this flag is billowing positive, towards the TV camera. Now that situation cannot be correct. It's a demonstration that this flag has been adjusted between the creation of the TV sequence and the still session. As no such adjustment has been recorded for posterity by the eyewitness TV camera, we can only conclude from the evidence that the TV coverage and photographic pictures recording this single event from Apollo 17 were actually imaged at different times, before and after. Does the intentional rearrangement of this flag merely indicate the duality of the NASA Never a Straight Answer records? Or does another message lie in the subject matter of the picture? Perhaps this composition of astronaut looking down at the camera and the flag pointing up to Earth in code, no departure from Earth for the named astronaut in this photograph.
Returning for a moment to the first mission, Apollo 11, and that classic image of Aldrin standing on the lunar surface, a picture often hijacked for commercial purposes, where then is the Hasselblad portrait of Armstrong, the very first human being to set foot upon another planet? Why have we no such picture?
I have it on first-hand account that the question was, well, now let's look at the best, first of all, for the best set of pictures of Neil. And then the faces tended to drop somewhat, and by the end they were saying, well, let's find any picture of Neil. And in fact there was only one there, which was Neil Armstrong, really a fair amount in the distance, working around the lunar module, which Buzz Aldrin had taken during part of a pan sequence, a geological pan sequence, which was called for in the photographic plan. Now, nobody cottoned on to the fact that nobody was taking a picture of Neil Armstrong, so that all the pictures which are seen on the covers of Life and now in the history books, they're all of Aldrin, which, you know, is fine, they're super pictures, but surely that you want a picture also of, at least, of the first man on the moon. It's just like, you know, Columbus having an artist, theoretically, and the artist busily sketching the palm trees the other way when Columbus steps onto the shore of the New World. History has no record.
It's very hard to believe that during preparation of the tasks to be performed, the NASA PR machine ignored this rather major detail, the planting of the first footprint, especially as every single action and image had been planned in advance and rehearsed until it became automatic. Surely such a major omission would have been noticed and corrected before departure. And in the light of Armstrong's virtually reclusive post-mission behavior, we can ask if the astronaut had personal reasons for being camera shy. Did he then, and does he now, feel some sort of guilt? Was he, in fact, never actually on the moon?
He's always been very helpful, but always struck me as being extremely businesslike. He responded to the point, he helped, and then that was it. So, quite typical.
Given the many crucial anomalies and inconsistencies we're unearthing in the Apollo imagery, we also have to ask again if Armstrong's central reason for avoiding the lens has to do with NASA's chosen procedures during the making of Apollo.
He was a very private individual, obviously, and since he has always kept himself very much to himself. During the various celebrations he's tended to appear, but it's as limited as possible, and if you might almost say decency allows.
Perhaps the Apollo space program would be better titled The Sound and Light Show, for what we actually hear or don't hear on the soundtracks is often inconsistent with both physics and the facts as presented to us. Just listen to this soundtrack as a bobsleigh team races down the famous Samaritz Bob Run. You can hear the pilot announcing the names of the corners they're negotiating.
That is the car called Wall. Next will be Snake 1 and Snake 2. And now is Sunny, Mesh and Dixon. And then is coming Horseshoe, Telephone, Shamrock, 3, Deep, Lock.
This is hugely exciting to listen to. We feel that we're virtually inside the bobsleigh with the team. Yet while this sport is no doubt enjoyable for the participants, it's also a highly stressful physical situation. Listening to the bob pilot, we can hear the vibration and the tension engendered by the sheer speed and potential danger of the situation. Now let's listen to the two Apollo 11 astronauts landing on another planet for the first time in history.
Feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. Okay, 75 feet. That's looking good, down a half. 6 forward. 30 seconds. Lights on, forward. Forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. Contact light.
These intrepid men in their Lunar module flying machine were virtually sitting on top of its descent engine, which was roaring away, producing up to 10,000 pounds of thrust and burning at a temperature of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. We also know there was air inside the LEM. It was pressurized to 1/3 sea level atmosphere, so the incredible roar of the engine would have produced considerable sound and vibration. According to some sources, even through their bubble helmets, the astronauts in the LEM could hear the noise of the thrusters firing, yet apparently they couldn't hear the roar of this powerful rocket engine. That's a little difficult to believe, isn't it? Even the space shuttle astronauts popping up into low Earth orbit have pointed out the extreme vibration and noise when thrusters fire from their craft, and the shuttle is very different from that of the flimsy LEM.
Funny.
Compare this
Mesh and Dixon
with this.
Okay, 75 feet. Car's looking good, down a half.
So unlike the pilot on the Bob run, the astronauts' voices on the Apollo 11 soundtrack sound unbelievably dull. There's no impression of vibration whatsoever, nor do we hear the roar of the rocket engine beneath them. Even more bizarre are the circumstances in this next scene from Apollo 12.
Just before these astronauts touched down, they were apparently able to film the Surveyor 3 craft that had landed at that same site in April '67. But instead of just catching a fleeting glimpse through the LEM's triangular window as the LEM continued on its descent path, this sequence from the conquest of space, using original NASA film, is very suspect. This result is wholly consistent with imagery that could only be taken with a specially mounted camera capable of considerable lateral panning capacity. As we run the sequence again, notice how the perspective of the grounded Surveyor 3 changes as the camera moves around it. The LEM didn't have that capability. To obtain such a shot would actually need a special camera mount to give plenty of sideways movement, while the craft, such as a helicopter with the door removed, maintained level flight. Here is a type of helicopter rig that will be required in order to create the result in question. The published imagery is therefore not commensurate with the viewpoint from an onboard camera at the LEM's triangular window.
Apollo 12 also had sound and light problems. They suffered from what was claimed to be a failed TV camera very early on in their moonwalk. This failure had the happy effect of turning the transmissions into sound only, and thus ensuring that millions of terrestrial TV sets were switched off.
This is what viewers saw prior to the TV camera failure. By the way, here might be a blow on the whistle concerning the lighting at the time.
Boy, that sun's bright. That's just like somebody shining a spotlight in your hand. It really is. It's just like somebody's got a super bright spotlight.
And then a reference to the TV camera.
Now, see, I'm doing some useful work like getting that TV camera going. Okay, good idea. Okay, Houston, I'm going to move the TV camera now.
As the TV camera is moved, we can see that it is functioning, because the light source has generated lens flare. The camera is being moved around pretty rapidly, and we can see it is picking up flare and strange striations into the lens, which is allegedly the point to which the camera is supposed to have failed.
There it is.
And here is a clip from an official NASA documentary relating to this incident.
Set to watch the moonwalk on TV, controllers were frustrated when the solar rays destroyed the camera.
So according to NASA, the solar rays destroyed the Apollo 12's TV camera. But in this scene from a later mission, Apollo 15, we have precisely the same effect, yet the camera continues to operate perfectly satisfactorily. Now here, back with Apollo 12, we have flare picked up by the lens, which indicates that the camera was actually working. It is just pointed at something static. However, the camera is not securely locked into position, and therefore over a period of time the camera changes its view, as you can see. And as you can hear, everyone thinks it's all very funny. But as the fixing on its stand is not tight enough, the camera is slowly drooping, and this fact is demonstrated by the changing images captured over a period of time.
Coming in there now, Al.
It would not have been possible to see this differential imaging if the camera had really been destroyed by being pointed for a while directly into the sun, the official reason for its failure. The operations manual and the handbook that accompanied the TV camera clearly indicate that the camera should never be pointed at any bright source, nor directly at the sun. Given their intensive training and the experiences supposedly acquired over the preceding Apollo missions, why then did Apollo 16 astronauts need to ask Houston if they should point their camera at the sun during a lunar EVA?
Point the camera away from the sun, they're all the way up and down. Yeah, the camera directly down sun. And down at the ground. Down, huh? That's right. Directly into the sun? Negative. Away from the sun and down.
We leave these sound and light anomalies for the moment to discuss one particular mission in April 1970, that of the lucky 7th lunar module, Aquarius, and the unlucky 13th command module, Odyssey. The alleged failure of the Apollo 12 camera had been a very good test for NASA and an indicator of the level of attention that America in particular and the world in general had towards the space program. Perhaps discouraged by Apollo 12's sound-only show and given other political realities in America, the public seemed to have turned its back on space. However, Bennett and Percy's research suggests that this was an intentionally induced state of boredom and was also, among other things, good preparation for the moment when NASA intended to switch their audience back on again. And during the 13th hour of the 13th day of their 13th Apollo mission, how very remarkable, just 2 days out from Earth, they toggled that switch and what was said to be an exploding oxygen tank jolted the command module and the Apollo story back into the media spotlight.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a BP bus thunderbolt.
Here we see the astronauts inside the command module delivering a live broadcast. They're supposedly nearly 200,000 miles from Earth and just 8 minutes from their Big Bang, or problem, as they would delicately put it. Remember, the command module was named the Odyssey and the lunar module Aquarius. Listen to this communication.
And passing through the time away and our transit out to the moon. And it's rather odd to see it floating like this in Odyssey while it's playing the theme from 2001.
So shortly before the astronauts signed off, the music used in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey was playing in the command module.
It's rather odd to see it floating like this in Odyssey.
In that last comment, the astronaut emphasized the word odd for us. And just how apposite was it that moments before the explosion and the enforced extracurricular use of the LEM Aquarius, he takes the trouble to mention their sign-off song, a song from the musical Hair, in which the words, "This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius" figure. Not to mention when the moon was in the 7th house. Who exactly is blowing the whistle now?
And of course the tapes would be complete without Aquarius.
The whole of this scenario has all the hallmarks of a carefully written script. Indeed, the words used to announce their accident to Houston, "We have a problem," were first spoken in much the same circumstances in 2001: A Space Odyssey.
What doesn't come from 2001, nor indeed from the Hollywood movie Apollo 13, is the bizarre colour of deep space in NASA's footage of the Apollo 13 mission. When the astronauts have transferred to the LEM, some 200,000 miles from Earth, we look out of the small observation window and see the colour blue. not the black of space that NASA's astronauts describe. The official NASA footage has the LEM's triangular windows entirely filled with a blue as bright as that of a cloudless summer's day here on Earth. It's astonishing. If these astronauts really were some 200,000 miles away from Earth, surely the windows of the LEM should be entirely filled with the black of deep space.
Were they too in low Earth orbit, as appeared to be the case with the Apollo 11 sequence we saw at the opening of this program?
Following the accident, the claimed oxygen tank explosion, a crew member photographed the supposed damage to the CSM.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing.
This is the damaged Odyssey. Now look at this picture of a command and service module with a cover removed from its scientific instrument bay. Looks rather similar to the damaged Odyssey, does it not?
Even supposing, as many experts claim, such an explosion would have thrown the spacecraft way off course, it seems that the Apollo 13 mission encountered more than just their exploding oxygen tank. Apparently, there would have been other problems too.
Fra Mauro is situated in the southwestern quadrant of the Moon, and what is of significance in relationship to this site is the position of the terminator, the line that marks the limit of the sunlit portion of the Moon. To be able to land on the Moon successfully, the LEM pilots needed to be able to see where they were going, and NASA has always emphasized that all landing sites and times were selected with this requirement in mind. But at the time of the Apollo 13 accident, their Fra Mauro landing site was in complete darkness, and, most significantly, it was to remain in darkness until long after the astronauts had left lunar orbit. This fact is clearly apparent from a computer reconstruction. And this fact can be checked with the help of a little rudimentary knowledge of astronomy and an ephemeris. But if you aren't mathematically inclined, don't worry, because the maths have been done and the results check out. It's also been confirmed by Andrew Chaikin, space historian and author of A Man on the Moon, which was written with the compliance of NASA, that concerning Apollo 13, Chaikin states, by Wednesday, April 15th, 2.5 days after the accident, the Apollo 13 combo had circumnavigated the Moon, corrected its trajectory, and was already 19,000 miles into its homeward journey. The Moon, still close enough to see craters with the unaided eye, and Fred Hayes, alone in Aquarius, was looking at it. And Chaikin tells us what Hayes saw, or rather, what he didn't see. Near the terminator, just emerging from night, he could barely make out the highland region of Fra Mauro. So there you have it. The Fra Mauro site was in darkness on the date scheduled for the landing of this lunar expedition. Whatever might be the truth concerning the exact whereabouts of Apollo 13, the Sun and the Moon do not alter their dance through space.
These examples are only just a few of the anomalies that researchers Bennett and Percy have discovered concerning Apollo 13. However, the sample shown is already enough to enable us to further see that something's very wrong with this mission in particular, and the Apollo space program in general. We certainly have to conclude that the official data concerning this mission is unreliable. The author's opinion is that Apollo 13 was never designed as a mission to actually land, but as an exercise in space rescue systems, an exercise held principally for the education and the benefit of both crew and mission control, while still fulfilling an integral part of the overall space program objectives. While these researchers consider that most operatives at Houston and their contractors were ignorant of the detail, they suspect that, somewhat obviously, the astronauts themselves were fully aware of their location, in low Earth orbit and nowhere near the Moon.
As we know exactly where the Terminator was during the mission, why, in the NASA-approved Hollywood movie version of Apollo 13, which featured Tom Hanks, why do the astronauts declare themselves able to see their landing site at Fra Mauro when approaching the Moon on Tuesday, the 14th of April? As we know, it was in complete darkness, so they're apparently pretty clever. But they do better than that. They are then able to spot, within the next 13 seconds, 2 other sites, Tsiolkovsky Crater and Mare Imbrium, in that order.
Look, it's Fra Mauro. I can see our landing site. Wow. Look
Look at that THE.VHS.VAULT crater. I can't believe how bright the ejector blanket is.
It's like snow. It's beautiful. It's Mare Imbrium to the north.
They must have had X-ray vision, for this observation is a physical impossibility. How could they be flying over the dark, far side of the moon and see Fra Mauro in darkness on the near side? And while the Sea of Tsiolkovsky was on the sunlit portion of the far side, it was well over 1,000 miles away. Then again, Mare Imbrium on the near side was mostly in darkness and again hidden from their view. So now, as we run that sequence again, note the trajectory of the spacecraft in relationship to the moon.
Look, it's Fra Mauro. I can see our landing site.
Wow. Look at that THE.VHS.VAULT crater. I can't believe how bright the ejector blanket is.
It's like snow. It's beautiful. It's Mare Imbrium to the north.
So here we have even more inaccuracies in the movie account of the Apollo 13 flight. However, as a method of discouraging investment in long-term manned space travel, this space drama could hardly be faulted. Indeed, this accident was later heralded by certain astronauts and other personnel as the reason for NASA's curtailment and eventual abandonment of manned deep space flight. The prospect of dead astronauts indefinitely looping around our solar system, an artificial Death Star featuring in our night skies for eternity, surely was motivation enough for the implementation of the Apollo surrogate program.
Could it be relevant that the Apollo 13 landing site that never was took its name from the 16th century Venetian monk Fra Mauro, who was the instigator of a map that never was? Fra, or Brother Mauro, was also cartographer to the court of Venice, and at one time he set about producing the perfect map of creation without removing himself from his cell. He apparently achieved this feat by collating the tales that travellers brought to him, yet no trace of his map has ever been found. There's only his journal of this experience, which was discovered on a Venetian island by author James Cowan, who then translated it into English. This adventure in mind mapping raises important questions concerning the links between representation and imagination, and even the nature of reality itself. Cowan found that Fra Mauro's thoughts revealed themselves gradually as an unfolding guessing game, and that the Venetian monk liked to derive meaning from the perfect use of mystery, and thus each place he evoked became a symbol. We wonder what exactly the Fra Mauro site symbolized for those in the know at NASA. But Cowan's book on Fra Mauro is apparently a hybrid of history and fiction, and as such, it fits perfectly with our view of NASA's well-scripted Apollo program.
And with this pause for the consideration of artistic license over, we return now to more analysis of the Apollo mission images and shadow inconsistencies.
Resuming with Apollo 14, here's another one of those shots of an astronaut descending the ladder. The shadow side of the LEM has been filled with light in the same way as that of the Apollo 11 LEM during Aldrin's exit. Is this for real, or is this being simulated on a film set?
Yes. All kinds of freebies in today's simulation. Roger, we got the boys in the back room working overtime.
This terrain where these Apollo 15 astronauts are standing is virtually flat. Then, note that the shadow here is somewhat similar in length to the astronaut's height. But, as we all know,
shadows really make a difference up here.
Yes, they certainly do. So as we move to this next scene, during the same mission, on similar terrain, the shadow length should not be any different to the previous shot.
Okay.
However, we can see that the astronaut's shadow length is now considerably longer than his equivalent height. Such anomalies, in our view, are once again due to the presence of a large artificial light source that is not always positioned at the same height. We have found irrefutable evidence of just such a large light source in some of these images. Whether inadvertently or intentionally, we can see evidence of a large source mirrored in the astronauts' gold outer visors. This is how an artificial superlight might have been assembled. comprising a large number of individual light panels creating a single ultra-powerful source and generating one shadow. Not unlike the makeup of stadium lights, only very, very much larger. Remember, the Shea Stadium in New York had powerful lighting back in the 1960s. Here you can see a very large reflection of a large superlight in a convex gold helmet visor. It is still large despite the fact that the camera is some distance away. Now, a convex, that is an outwardly curved surface, always considerably reduces the size of whatever's being reflected. If this large bright reflection were the sun, given its distance from the subject, it would be barely visible when reflected in a visor, nothing more than a tiny pinprick of light. Yet in many cases these convex visors are reflecting a very large light, which indicates the use of a huge artificial light source. Let's compare these images depicting the large light reflections with this picture of a space shuttle astronaut during an EVA. The space shuttle operates at a distance a mere few hundred miles above the Earth. Although this photo was taken close up, we can see the sun reflected in the visor is nothing more than a pin source of light. And another example, this is an EVA during a Gemini mission. We can only conclude that the large reflections in these Apollo images really are telltale evidence that artificial superlights were used to illuminate these alleged lunar scenes.
So it would appear that the Apollo images reflect the circumstances surrounding the taking of such pictures, and this means that an artificial superlight appears to have been used for the recording of Live on the Moon TV coverage, as well as the photography. Again, we must ask ourselves if attempting to pass off this reflected light source as the sun is a sign of arrogance, or were the photographers blowing a very clear whistle? At this point one might say, hold on a minute, how did your alleged whistleblowers get away with all of this, right under NASA's nose? And why hasn't all this been noticed before now? Well, if you're not suspecting foul play, you're not alerted to the need for proof of foul play. As Hitler said, the bigger the lie, the easier it is for people to believe it. The authority of NASA was enough for us all to accept its images as the truthful depiction of the exploration of the moon in 1969. Because these visors just had to reflect the sun, didn't they? Now let's examine a hypothesis that is seemingly ridiculous. Could the entirety of the Apollo images have been created in the controlled environment of interior or exterior studio sets? As the sheer magnitude of achieving such a task without being discovered or denounced would appear to be beyond the bounds of possibility, most people are quick to laugh this hypothesis off as an example of conspiracy theory run amok. Yet before we dismiss it so readily, let's remember that it's initially easier to dismiss outrageous ideas even if they should eventually be proven correct. Simply because we might not want to face up to uncomfortable truths, and because to acknowledge that truth would make us look complete fools. It is apparently okay to acknowledge the lack of authenticity of the visual information surrounding an event safely buried in the relatively distant past, such as the sinking of the Lusitania by 3 torpedoes.
This event, which had the effect of bringing America into the First World War, happened out of sight of a British newsreel camera. But that detail didn't stop the media creating a fake scene, shot on a London pond, and presenting the result to the public as the authentic coverage of that incident.
As an example of the deliberate withholding of information at the turn of the century, we learned that the prime cause of the horrific accident that led to the demise of the Hindenburg was not hydrogen, as ruled after the accident, but was actually the nature of the fabric covering the dirigible. It's now clear that this outer fabric was known at the time to have been highly inflammable. The fact that the constructors then continued to use a medium known to be potentially lethal is of no surprise to an industry that has spawned its own series of disasters.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up. 1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And as we're finding out, what worked for the past masters of aeronautics is seemingly still valid. Would it have been possible to pull off the task of faking the record?
To create a set of stills and the TV coverage on the scale of Apollo would certainly require considerable resources. It would also need an exciting storyline full of dramatic events and human interest, requiring scriptwriters, actors and costumes. These would then need studios, cameras, lighting and of course sets. But we suggest that all preparations and making the pre-recorded TV coverage took place over such a long period and was so woven into the everyday life of the Apollo space program that even though this particular odyssey was made literally under the very noses of innocent employees and contractors, the fact that the final cut was phony went undetected at the time.
Returning to the matter in hand, Apollo and the moonwalkers, is there any evidence that mountain backgrounds used in the Apollo imagery could possibly have been multiple-use artificial backdrops?
There appear to be some blatant discrepancies in the location of the LEM in relation to the surrounding landscape in Apollo 17. There seem to be some serious multiple uses of mountain backdrops. Any given background can be the same size irrespective of the scale of the scene. This is often the case despite the varying distances that the photographers, their equipment and the LEM were supposed to be from any of these mountain backdrops. The EVA route at the Taurus-Littrow Valley, the areas where the two astronauts allegedly drove their roving vehicle and then walked on foot, extends many miles away from the landing site towards the lower region of this map. This is the landing spot at Taurus-Littrow. As the camera pulls back, we can see that all these mountains are located well away from the LEM's landing site. Now I'd like to draw your attention to some rather peculiar features in the mountains of Taurus-Littrow that appear in the record. In the background is a rather distinctive mountain with a steepish slope on the left and a gradual slope off to the right. Centrally positioned is a light-coloured mound and an interesting mini crater feature inset above it. And over to the right is another mound with a larger, darker crater-like feature. We'll be seeing more of this mountain and the mounds in the sequences that follow. Here again is the light-coloured mound on the left, and in the centre the second mound with its larger, darker, crater-like feature. Notice in the left foreground are some experiment packages. And now with the LEM in the foreground, you'll recognise the mound with the dark crater-like feature. We have confirmation of the LEM's apparent close proximity to this location by way of this image as well. Note the two key features, the light-coloured mound on the left and the second mound with a darker feature to the right. But when we look again at the wide view of the valley with an astronaut standing by the large split rock, we can see there's no apparent sign whatsoever of the LEM in relation to the scale of the mountains we were looking at in the previous image. Here's another view, this time looking over split rock. Notice the crater in the centre with no obvious sign of the lunar module at all. We now return to the split rock location, and an even wider composited image revealing an area to the right of the boulder. Surprisingly, this is the area in the centre of the picture where the LEM is supposed to have landed. Look how tiny it is in relation to the setting and the surrounding mountain landscape. What anomalous scaling compared with the close-up view of the LEM we saw earlier. As we bring the centre larger, notice how small the LEM looks in relation to what appear to be absolutely enormous mountains. Returning to the footage we saw previously, compare the mountains seen in the TV coverage with those in this still photograph. They're virtually identical, yet the LEM is absent from the still image and present in the TV coverage. Let's take a closer look at other imaging anomalies at this site and the continuity of the LEM in relation to its backgrounds. This wide view is looking across the Taurus-Littrow Valley with the distinctive mountain, the light-coloured mound and the little feature above it. Now as we mix through to the TV coverage, the LEM is clearly at the same location. Compare this still image, from which the LEM is absent, with what is obviously the same location where the LEM is present. Although the lighting has changed, the mountain is recognisably the same. All very surprising, because earlier we registered that the LEM was absent from this spot. We also noted that the LEM had apparently landed well away from these mountains. But in this TV freeze, we see exactly the same mountain yet again, with the LEM.
Have the mountains been moved to suggest a different location between one set of images and another, cost-saving on scenic backgrounds, or has the LEM itself been moved?
It looks as though the mountains were moved around. You see, money was no object with Apollo, so we must conclude that this action is a further example of intentional whistleblowing by those involved. I'm now going to run a 360-degree TV panorama sequence at that location. Identified as EVA-1, Site 1, it was shot from the rover's TV camera, remotely operated from Mission Control. Notice the shadow of the LEM in the foreground and the pair of mountains in the distance. But these appear to be mountains with unique qualities. We saw earlier that this distant view, seen on the TV coverage, is the location of the LEM, here in the middle distance. So how can the same view possibly exclude the LEM? As we continue with the panorama, we should return to the point where we started, with the distinctive mountain in the background and the LEM in the foreground. However, that doesn't happen, as we'll see. We can state with confidence that this part of the 360-degree panorama that we've extracted from another take, EVA-2, Site 5, is intended to suggest a different location in the valley. But here's the distinctive mountain with a lighter coloured mound. And the LEM? Surprise, surprise, there's no sign of the LEM whatsoever this time. Either the LEM was moved away, or this is a studio set with movable mountain elements forming the background to the foreground action. These continuity discrepancies cannot be explained in any other way. The clue to ascertaining what may have actually occurred lies in establishing that the darker markings on the left-hand side of the background mountain are common to all these images. NASA would have us believe that these pictures were taken many miles apart, but if that were the case, the perspective of the mountains would vary drastically. On the contrary, the markings on the left side of the distinctive mountain remain constant. They're in the same place in relation to this steepish slope on the left, in every case. Put another way, in relation to this slope, these markings should move to the right as one moves further to the left of the valley. But the only noticeable difference is that this mound to the right changes its position, revealing the mound with a darker inset feature, but other elements of the scene do not substantially change in any of these views. Despite the fact that the LEM is supposed to have landed well away from any mountains, in the images with astronauts present, the mountain backdrops are never very far away at all.
So why do images with action in the foreground have backgrounds that appear so close?
No doubt this situation is the consequence of limitations imposed by working in a studio environment, without the benefit of backgrounds miles away, as would have been the case at the true location. It was possible, though, to create the illusion of a vast landscape for some of the impressive scene-setting imagery, especially the stills. Here again is the TV coverage of the LEM's supposed landing site, emphasizing that the location is nowhere near the mountains that form the backdrop to the previous images. This picture of the LEM, so close to its background, cannot possibly relate to the suggested location of the LEM in this image. The distant scaling discrepancies in the various backgrounds gives it all away. Yet more examples of inconsistencies in the record.
Is there any further evidence of mountains being moved around, and is it possible to detect any joins in the working area which could show telltale breaks, say, between the studio floor, the surface area and vertical mountain background?
Yes. In virtually every case, whether stills imaging or TV coverage, we can see just such a join line between the key elements, the horizontals and the verticals. In our view, had these images been taken in a natural location, this obvious join line would not be in evidence. And here in this illustration, you can clearly see how the working area and the mountain background with its supports would be separated, resulting in just such a join line showing up in the images as an obvious break. Rather significantly, in the 1971 James Bond movie, Diamonds Are Forever, when Bond penetrates the Willard White tectonic site in the desert outside Las Vegas, Nevada, he eventually finds himself on an interior moon set, surrounded by 3 separate levels of movable flats depicting lunar mountains. We also see the wooden supporting structure of these mountain backgrounds. A gallery full of sound, light and computing equipment, as well as actonauts practicing slow-mo movements. And finally, when Bond escapes on a hybrid of a rover and a LEM through the flimsy wall of this moon set, we see that he's emerging from the grey domed building that looks remarkably like the northern hemisphere of the moon. This entire scene is, without doubt, whistleblowing on a very grand scale.
So, David Percy considers that Bond sequence to be whistleblowing. But surely one scene in a film does not a true story make. This single scene could be construed as an amused nod of the head on the part of the filmmakers to the Apollo hoax theory that was already circulating by 1970. That having been said, there's no doubt at all that author Ian Fleming had his finger on the pulse of world events. Through his intelligence contacts, he kept abreast with both Soviet and American rocket technology and received technical updates and advice from the British Interplanetary Society.
It is quite clear that Diamonds Are Forever contains information as to how the Apollo, witnessed by the world, was actually staged. Either the whole film script was totally inspired, or someone in the know clearly seeded information into the film. For although the original book storyline would have worked very well for the movie, new situations were grafted onto Fleming's principal locations. This film contains a multitude of relevant covert references to the anomalies in the Apollo program. Another example concerns the dangers of radiation. In a very memorable scene, immediately prior to the interior moon set sequence, in Diamonds Are Forever, Bond highlights the subject of radiation.
Hello.
Hi.
Haven't seen you here before.
I'm Klaus Hergesheimer.
New here.
I've been here 3 years. G-section.
How are things in G-section?
Well, still the same old grind, you know, checking radiation shields for replacement. Hey, by the way, where's yours?
I've been waiting a couple of days for you guys to deliver them.
Oh, gee, I'm sorry. You should have given us a phone call. Yeah, look, I've got one here. Lucky for you, I carry spares. Now, you keep that on. You can't be too careful about radiation.
Absolutely. I feel much safer with this on.
See you around.
Who are you? What do you want? Klaus Hergesheimer, G-section. Just checking on radiation shields. Now, let me see. You are...
Professor Dr. Metz. Our shields are fine. Now get out.
Thank you very much.
We will be looking at the hazards of space radiation later in the program. The movie Diamonds Are Forever is confirmation, though, that some works of fiction can communicate vital clues. Producing an Apollo sound and light show in a studio would naturally imply the use of moving image creation and sound recording facilities.
Using conventional motion picture film for the pre-creation of the live TV coverage would have been very risky, as film could easily get scratched or even break during transmission. The best material for the purpose would have been videotape. This was not widely used in the 60s, but it was in use by NASA and the US government. Using an emerging technology would enable the perpetrators of a hoax to pull off the trick with impunity. Don't forget, in the 1960s, the networks had to film off TV screens during the transmissions. Today, this is an aspect of the Apollo story that many engineers and producers find highly suspect. The best result would have been to provide the networks with a direct video feed, but they did not do that.
So we now have to ask, could early video equipment have been used in the generation of the live TV coverage of Apollo?
We did use early videotape machines, Ampex VR660 and later on an Ampex VR1100, the quad tape machine. And we kept those tapes on site for quite a long time. We received that FM carrier down on the Earth, ran it through an FM demodulator, and processed it in an RCA scan converter that took the slow scan picture and converted it to the American standard black and white television signal, and then sent that on to Houston. When we were converting from slow scan to fast scan, RCA used the disc in the scan recorder as a memory, so it played back the same video several times until it got updated video.
In other words, the incoming signal was recorded onto a magnetic disc for black and white TV, and for colour it had first to be recorded onto tape recorder 1, then played back on tape recorder 2. Only then could there be a conventional colour TV picture.
The idea that what we all saw on our screens in July 1969 was actually live from the moon recedes by the minute. Are there any indications that the moonwalk sequences were actually filmed on Earth under studio conditions? And how difficult would it have been to simulate the moon's 1/6 gravity?
Researchers have noticed that when the rover was filmed driving across the dusty surface, the dust thrown up by the rover's wheels clumps, just as it would if it were driven in a location where there's an atmosphere. Had the rover really been performing in a vacuum, the lunar conditions, not only would the dust have sprayed out in a perfect and progressive parabolic arc, but due to the reduced gravity, this arc would have risen up to 6 times higher than it would have done on Earth. This Apollo footage records the dust actually being stopped in its tracks as it encounters an atmosphere.
The moon has a much lower surface gravity, like it's 1/6 of the surface gravity on the Earth. So pictures of falling things, you see things moving, falling slowly, and you see people moving about as if they don't weigh very much. So faking these motion pictures, and remember that many of the pictures returned from the Apollo project were motion pictures, that really show people operating in an environment where they weigh, their equipment weighs about 1/6 of what it would on the Earth. So it's really very difficult to fake in a studio on the Earth, where the gravity would of course be normal.
In the 1999 revised edition of Apollo, From the Earth to the Moon, an astronaut is heard to say, "There's no dust at all," which is only possible if the exercise is taking place on a hard surface.
9 miles an hour. Like you see, I'm going to have to keep my eyes on the road.
However, there are carving lines through the loose surface coating.
Up a little rise. There's no dust at all. Steering is quite responsive.
And if there are tracks in the surface coating, then there should also be significant movement of surface material arcing out from under the wheels of the rover. In this respect, the new sequence is in direct contrast to the original 16mm Apollo camera footage. The statement, "there's no dust," doesn't even belong with this action, but with the earlier arrival of the LEM. The rewriting of the record, for which there is allegedly already authentic documentation, does not in any way help to preserve the real credentials of the original. It only demonstrates that in a probable attempt to avoid the scandal of the millennium, NASA has chosen to support a revised edition of Apollo. But in our view, the agency has chosen poorly. Astronauts moving in slow motion is another hallmark of the Apollo TV footage. There is no evidence at all of any astronaut making a leap or a jump anywhere near a height commensurate with 1/6 G possibilities. But if they were actually simulating EVAs on Earth, they would then need help with their bulky heavyweight suits and backpacks in order to achieve the visual effect of moving around easily in lunar gravity. So enter wire supports. This is a tried and tested way of relieving weight from performers, or even flying an actor. Here is a sequence from one of our own productions.
Excuse me, will I need a car?
Relax, Chris. We're only making a short journey back to 1969, to the beginning of universe.
Of course, Confirmation that wires were used is in the detail. Here in this Apollo 14 footage, you can see a ping, a momentary glint. And again, run slowly. And once more. There are other examples too. This one is from Apollo 17 during the flag scene. You can see the ping at the top of the frame. In this footage from Apollo 16, we have telltale evidence of a slightly floating or dangling effect at the jump salute location. It's as if the weight is being taken off the astronaut's feet just a second or so too soon. Compare that sequence with an obvious rehearsal rig. The dangling effect is very evident. And here again, from the same mission, Apollo 16, we have an astronaut who is about to get up.
Give me a hand. Okay, here we go.
Let me give you a hand, he says.
There goes bag. There goes another bag. Bag. Coming.
Look at it again. The astronaut is getting up with a wire taking the weight, relieving him of 5/6 of the Earth's gravity. A magic trick? No, just the help of a wireman. This is a slow-motion jump as it would have been seen live on TV. And here it is at normal speed. The well-rehearsed, pre-recorded material was apparently slowed down by 50% when we saw it on TV. And yes, we've done the necessary work to establish that percentage.
How was the slow motion effect achieved?
Well, creating these 1/6 slow simulations would have been a relatively straightforward process. First, the scene would have been photographed and recorded onto videotape at the normal rate in the US, 30 frames per second. On playback, the recording would have been slowed down to half speed. As each video frame is made up of 2 different fields, this will give 60 different frames of image per second, because each individual field now becomes a frame. We must remember that the live TV transmissions were filmed off TV screens for posterity. The archiving of the Apollo moonwalks was on 60mm film, just like this. Movie film has an entirely different makeup to that of a videotape recording. Film only has frames and not fields. So when the resulting footage was filmed off a TV screen, the fact that the playout of the original video was slowed down to half speed would have gone totally undetected and remain virtually undetectable. Now this is how the jump salute would have looked at normal speed before being slowed down by the method just described. Looks rather like it would on Earth, does it not? The video equipment used in Apollo was early generation. Therefore it would have been recorded onto 2-inch tape, the state of the art in the 1960s.
If you remember, there was a beautiful piece of footage from the Apollo 15 mission where the astronauts demonstrated the surface gravity on the moon by holding a hammer in one hand and a feather in the other. Now, it was proved in physics a long time ago that objects fall at the same speed, it doesn't matter how heavy they are, and a feather will fall at the same speed as a hammer. And the only reason that the feather doesn't fall at the same speed as a hammer in this room is because the resistance of the air in the room slows down the feather. If you do this experiment on the moon, they both fall together. And this piece of footage that shows this done by the camera pointing at the astronaut, dropping the hammer and the feather, and sure enough they both fall together, and that proves immediately that this experiment was done in a vacuum. So this movie set would have to have been evacuated. It would have to be a vacuum. But more than that, the 2 objects fall slowly. They would fall 6 times faster on the Earth because the gravity is stronger. You see them fall slowly on the moon.
And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the 2 of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that?
This is also a very difficult image to fake.
Well, actually, it isn't at all difficult to fake. NASA itself would repeat the very same trick, this time officially in the 1999 story From the Earth to the Moon. This time the astronaut held the hammer the other way up, so that we could see it was not the same fakery as the first time. Of course, that original demonstration by Apollo 15 doesn't in any way prove that it had taken place on the moon. Before NASA reenacted the whole thing officially, we had already conducted our own experiment. Here we are in our London studio in 1G, complete with an atmosphere, and without the benefit of a vacuum chamber. There they go. As you can see, the feather and the hammer arrive on the ground at the same time. Now if we slow it down by the appropriate amount, lo and behold, these two items fall nice and slowly as per a 1/6 G environment. This illusion is all about calibration.
Following their research, Bennett and Percy have arrived at a firm conclusion regarding the reason for the anomalies and inconsistencies found in both the stills and TV coverage of Apollo.
All the apparent mistakes that we have observed are, in our view, deliberate. We think it's very possible that some of those who were involved in the design and execution of the sets, the photography, lighting and production were perhaps very distressed when they realized what they were expected to do under the guise of service to their employers and their government. For NASA is a government agency, and their contractors grade their staff with security clearances in the same way as the military do. It is possible that instead of courting what could be life-threatening danger by standing up and blowing a whistle in public, these brave souls encoded their work with deliberate mistakes that will be detected sometime in the future, long after the emotion of the event had cooled.
What does Una Ronald, who was in Western Australia at the time, think about these attempts at fakery?
When I saw the Coke bottle, for me, the whole moon landing from that point was a fake. It was a setup. And if it was a setup, it must have been filmed somewhere on Earth. And it would have been filmed, to my way of thinking, in America, at some lonely site, or alternatively in a huge indoor set, somewhere where they could be private, be secluded, be able to produce this quite passable picture of someone walking on the moon.
Most of us will recall that famous movie Capricorn 1, featuring 3 astronauts who are hoisted out of the launch rockets at the last minute to be informed that the technology won't get them to Mars safely. So in the interests of maintaining the space program, they must take part in the simulation of their voyage to Mars. Less well known is the fact that one of the originators of this storyline was Bill Kaysing, and that the destination of the original story was not Mars, but the moon.
People at an extremely high level came up with the entire simulation, which was then filmed in Las Vegas in Area 51 at the northeast corner of what used to be the Atomic Energy Test Station there, and also at Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino.
The convincing evidence presented so far in this program strongly suggests that the TV coverage and the photographic record of Apollo is faked. How does NASA respond to these findings?
You're coming to NASA, which is the organization that's being accused by this person of having put together the most monumental hoax in the history of humanity. I would simply say if this person or any people believe that they have some sort of, stunning, earth-shattering scientific finding that proves we didn't go to the moon, don't bring it to us. Take it to the scientific community. Take it to the Royal Academy.
The big question must now be, why did the Apollo imagery have to be faked? Could there have been technological problems in leaving Earth orbit and actually arriving at the moon in the first place? After that, it would have been necessary to achieve a safe landing, a moonwalk without accidents, a safe departure, and an extremely difficult re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. If all of that was achieved, then splashdown was a relatively minor detail. Experts are of the opinion that a serious failure in any one of these phases could have jeopardized not only an individual mission, but the entire future of the space program. Was there a compelling reason for the faking of the Apollo record?
Apart from the radiation risks, there are, in all probability, magnetic and gravitational anomalies that make the whole business of landing and taking off from the moon very dangerous indeed. And perhaps the consequences of these mascons, massive concentrations of gravity, and other anomalies would have made acceptable visual images difficult to guarantee, so that in any event, imagery would have to have been created before and independently of any given mission.
Some think it highly likely that surrogate astronauts were actually sent to the moon, while the named NASA astronauts were obliged to play out the role of space heroes, far nearer to home, remaining in the relative safety of low Earth orbit. As actors in a drama, the named astronauts represented this great achievement of mankind, whilst others unknown travelled beyond the confines of their home planet for the first time, to all intents and purposes naked before creation, as we shall see in a moment. Whilst in flight and for the duration of any stay on the lunar surface, the Apollo astronauts would have been totally at the mercy of unpredictable solar particle events. Solar flares could have affected any moon-bound astronaut at any time. A dose of 170 rem could result in vision impairment with a 20 to 30% probability of death within 60 days. Even a relatively low dose, around 70 rem, could result in vomiting, nausea, and diarrhea during the trip. Throwing up into a spacesuit is not something NASA would wish to be broadcast live on TV. There was even the possibility of an astronaut dying on the lunar surface in front of millions of viewers back on Earth. Therefore, sending astronauts to the moon with these risks could be described as playing American solar flare roulette.
With the Naval Research Laboratory, NASA launched the SOLRAD satellite. It too studies the sun's radiation and records the disturbances which can disrupt long-range communications and navigation systems. This computer-type picture shows the sun's disk and inner corona. It was returned by OSO 7, the latest in the orbiting solar observatory series. OSO is trying to determine the direct effects solar flares have on the environment, weather, and communications. Earth is surrounded by the magnetosphere, an enormous teardrop-shaped region formed by the solar wind, a supersonic stream of particles blowing on the Earth's magnetic field. It is in this region that a craft like the small scientific satellite does its job.
Einstein once presumed to speak for God when he joked, "God does not play dice." But some would say playing dice with nature is the game NASA played if the agency did indeed send insufficiently protected astronauts through the Van Allen radiation belts and onwards to the moon. So now let's look at this question of radiation and see if and how it posed a serious threat to the successful outcome of Apollo. What in general terms are the dangers of radiation out in deep space? We're not referring to the heat coming from the sun, but the effect of solar particle events, SPEs, including X-rays and gamma rays, on our spacecraft and an unprotected astronaut travelling beyond the protected environment of his home planet. What actually happens when an astronaut leaves the Earth for the moon? A human being leaving Earth for deep space has to travel through the very thick ringed donut of trapped radiation which permanently encircles our planet. This donut contains within it two specific natural zones of very intense radiation. The whole region is named after Dr. James Van Allen, the scientist who registered this discovery in 1958. The innermost zone of the two Van Allen belts surrounds us only some 272 miles out from the Earth's surface.
Entering the Van Allen radiation belt from below, you would see the radiation levels rising considerably. In fact, they're higher within the belt than they are above it, and much higher than they are below it. And then as you got above the Van Allen radiation belt, the radiation would still be very, very high, but lower than this radiation that's trapped within the belt. So those form a formidable barrier to the passage of manned spacecraft within these belts. This radiation varies year by year. The sun has an 11-year sunspot cycle, and every 11 years it appears to repeat. And so every 11 years there's a peak of sunspot activity, and this is associated with a peak of solar radiation. These peaks have been charted from the 1800s all the way to the present. And one of the recent peaks was in 1958, which is one of the reasons they decided to have the International Geophysical Year, and one of the reasons that Explorer 1 discovered the Van Allen radiation belts and all of this type of phenomena. And since then, the next peak was in 1969 and 1970, right when the Apollo missions were supposed to have flown through them. They couldn't have picked a worse time to try to fly a manned flight through this radiation field.
Dr. James Van Allen had pointed out the necessity to shield the astronaut spacecraft adequately, given that these belts of trapped radiation were dangerous to bioorganisms. Since 1962, the Van Allen belts also possess another zone of even more intense radiation, which was artificially introduced by the American military. We suspect that with Operation Starfish Prime, the exploding of a megaton nuclear bomb 248 miles above Earth, NASA was trying to force a corridor through this natural danger zone, but ended up making matters worse. Astronomer Sir Bernard Lovell stated at the time that the effects of this explosion were cataclysmic, both here on Earth and out in space. The radiation created by this engineered explosion was trapped into a third belt, over 100 times more intense than the two natural belts. By 2002, this artificial zone will still be 25 times worse than the most intense zone of radiation trapped within the natural belts. Had NASA not only failed with Starfish Prime to create a corridor, but also increased the radiation risk to unprotected astronauts?
During their research, Bennett and Percy have found that the depth of these Van Allen belts varies considerably according to the source of reference. Despite the fact that numerous probes and the Apollo missions have allegedly traversed these zones of intense radiation, there's little or no agreement on the depth of these zones. James Van Allen stated that they're at least 64,000 miles deep, whereas NASA claims they're only about 24,000 miles deep. Less depth equals less travel time through this danger zone, and as NASA maintains that the Earth-Moon round trip would involve just about 2 hours in the belts, the agency could, and did, just about avoid the issue of spacecraft shielding by asserting that this was too short a time to be of any real danger to its astronauts.
Such a claim is rather like believing that rain will wet you less if you run through it. In reality, whether you move slowly or quickly through rain, you'll tend to get equally as wet. And so it is with radiation, except that with radiation you cannot dry off and return to the state you were before you were irradiated. Radiation is present throughout deep space and alters everything that it comes into contact with. It becomes a part of any bioorganism. Our research findings suggest that firstly, on a return journey to the Moon or Mars, an astronaut would spend around 4 hours within the trapped radiation of the Van Allen belts. And secondly, that to protect human beings adequately for the duration of such a journey in the late 1960s would require a spacecraft far too heavy for any of Wernher von Braun's rockets to launch.
But we're getting rather ahead of ourselves. We'll come back to von Braun's Saturn V rocket shortly. In an interview with researcher Jim Collier in the late 1990s, Dr. James Van Allen said that he stood by his evaluation of the depth and danger of the belts.
There are cosmic rays in space. You have the radiation flux that you have to deal with out there. We understood that. We monitored the sun very, very carefully. We did not send expeditions to the moon at times when there was the possibility of a particle event on the sun. We didn't want to subject the astronauts to any radiation that could come flying off the sun from a solar flare or a prominence or an event like that. But we thought it through very carefully, and we planned our way through that.
NASA would have us believe that to send its astronauts through space at the height of solar activity was a matter entirely under its control, but it's impossible even today to predict when debilitating solar flares are going to occur. Predicting earthquakes is virtually impossible too. This is the aftermath of the Turkish 1999 quake that came with no warning. And again, the Taiwanese 1999 earthquake.
So if the prediction of solar particle events is impossible, what were the means of protecting a crew when travelling through deep space in an unshielded, thin-walled rocket ship?
You could use propellant, structure, other parts of the craft, the heat shield. You would design it so that you would maximize the amount of material between you and the sun for the flight, but try to avoid carrying any material just for the sake of the shielding. It would serve a dual purpose.
With aluminium shielding, it's accepted that the minimum requirement is a thickness of 10 centimeters all around the craft. Was there any attempt to provide such protection?
No. The walls of the craft were made as thin and light as possible. The Apollo capsule itself was made unusually thin. In fact, they couldn't even initially carry enough air inside to be the equivalent to sea level air pressure. They ran it at reduced pressure in order to be able to make the walls thinner. And then the LEM and other parts of the craft were all made out of very thin material, very flimsy. Almost no protection at all against solar radiation.
So why not try using a solid shield to protect the astronauts from these dangers?
Well, they didn't know how to put a shield like you suggest and still be able to make the weight capability of the Saturn V and carry everything to the moon. I believe that Wernher von Braun's team was basically assigned the task of designing a rocket that theoretically could take men to the moon if everything worked and if there were no substantial solar radiation. But the kind of rocket that they would have had to have in order to take people to the moon, taking into account solar radiation, would have been a much more massive vehicle, and they just decided that this was not something that they needed to deal with. They would just tell everybody that the radiation was okay.
A spherical structure enables a craft to withstand a greater amount of internal pressure. The Soviets knew this simple fact, and the designs for their spacecraft were always spherical. Here's a typical Vostok capsule. Compare this with the American thin-walled CSM design.
If NASA didn't know how to protect astronauts from radiation in deep space, it had not been for the want of trying. During the Manhattan Project and for years afterwards, the American government subjected nearly 250,000 Americans, both military and unwitting civilians, to the effects of radiation. These enforced tests provided data on how solar radiation might affect future astronauts. During the experimental detonations of atomic bombs, American military personnel were ordered to walk towards ground zero, totally unprotected. They were ordered to walk straight into the radiation zone, so that their masters could acquire an extensive information base relating to the injuries and damage caused to human tissue by those in close proximity to this radiation.
The surface of the moon is, of course, above the Van Allen radiation belts, and it's exposed to direct solar radiation. In 1959, they sent a spacecraft that flew past the moon. So that spacecraft could easily have, that one or others that followed it, could easily have contained instruments that showed them how lethal the radiation was. You don't need live animals to prove that something can't live out there. You can just send instruments that will show you that the radiation is beyond what can be withstood by animals or humans.
Solar flares and other storm systems on the sun can create enormous, tremendous surges of radiation. Now that radiation is not only potentially dangerous, it could be lethal to those who are outside our atmosphere, which basically protects us. All right, it can cause problems with radio storms and the aurora and things like that, but with major storms there is a dramatic threat to those who are outside the Earth's atmosphere. And this would have happened with the Apollo missions. Of course, if there had been a major solar flare during an Apollo mission to the moon, it would have been extremely serious, to say the least.
The versatile IMP, 8th in a series, is exploring interplanetary space and the outer fringes of the Earth's magnetosphere. It also provides warnings of possible solar flare radiation hazards to moon-bound astronauts.
No major incident occurred, but it could have been potentially very, very bad, very bad, lethal, in fact.
Remember, solar flares occur all the time. It's the degree of their severity that varies. One of the most severe solar flares ever recorded occurred in August 1972 between Apollo missions 16 and 17. This single flare would have delivered 960 rem of virtually instant death to any inadequately protected astronaut out beyond the Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field. Surely reason enough for the space agency to play safe and adopt the surrogate option, as prediction of these events is a very inexact science indeed. Yet the named astronauts were wandering around on the supposed lunar surface in nothing more than what amounts to a thick linen suit. These pressure suits might have allowed for some micro-meteorite protection and possibly maintained an appropriate temperature for the astronaut, but they certainly did not qualify as adequate protection against any unexpected burst of debilitating radiation from an SPE. And as if that were not enough, despite strict medical instructions, in some cases these astronauts neglected to use the protective gold visors to shield their faces. Whether this was whistleblowing or sheer arrogance, it is certainly another example of inconsistency in the record, over and beyond that of image manipulation. Forgetting the astronauts for a moment, what indeed could this solar radiation do to the images? We know, for example, how X-rays can affect film on Earth, and we know how the photographs of the damaged Chernobyl nuclear power station were badly fogged from radiation.
You have an enormous amount of radiation in space, and potentially it affects film, of course, and of course, as you will well know, its prime effect is on contrast.
We took a latent image recorded on the film of the color test chart and exposed it to 8 MeV X-rays. The lowest radiation dose we applied to the film was 25 rem. The latent image, if it hadn't been subjected to radiation, would look like this: a good quality, high contrast, color transparency. After exposure to the 25 rem radiation, the image is almost entirely obliterated. This means, in my estimation, a dose as little as 5 rem would seriously undermine the transparency. It would look significantly fogged. It would be a very thin image.
If you look at the results, top quality duplicates, you can see that there appears to be no effect whatsoever. It never got to the stage where I heard, at least, that a film had been badly affected by temperature or the pressure differentiation or radiation.
I would expect to see on the transparencies evidence of small bright dots where a high-velocity nuclear particle had impinged on that film. I have no evidence whatsoever that this has occurred. The good place to look for it is on the regions of the film which haven't been exposed in the camera, the black spaces, as it were, between the frames. We're protected on Earth by a nice thick atmosphere, and that combined with the magnetic field keep these ionizing particles away from us, on film of course. In space you're not offered that protection. To prevent an ionizing particle, or very energetic particles that you get in space, from damaging the film, you would need a significant thickness of lead protecting that film.
So if the film exhibited no signs of radiation damage, then surely the camera itself must have been protected. Was the Hasselblad lunar surface camera shielded from radiation?
Well, the original ones were not protected at all. The ones they brought to the lunar surface were painted silver.
The temperature, of course, is very, very extreme on the lunar surface. In the sunlight, you could be easily as high as about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And, of course, in shadow areas and prolonged shadow, you could be in minus quantities.
As far as I know, they had no trouble with overheating of the film. And I think it worked for them, because I didn't hear any complaints about the film getting too warm. On the other hand, they might have had some trouble if the film got too cold, because then it cracked.
Would any of the problems cited have anything at all to do with Kodak's strange reticence to capitalize commercially on the film used for the lunar surface photography?
Although various films were tried by NASA, to all intents and purposes, it was only Kodak film which was used during Project Apollo. And I think, and one understands it, I think that the corporate management in Rochester was concerned about a monopoly situation. I think that was the reason, you know, and it's sad in some ways because there was an enormous amount could be made of the fact that it was Kodak film being used.
Okay, let's see, how do I do this? F11 at 74. Click. Click.
There's the pan. Okay.
Click. 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 Okay, Tony, do you want me to change the mags on the
EVA
16? It's about empty. Click. That's affirmative. Per second runs it through there.
Right, go ahead.
Okay, will do.
Should be mag R.
Okay. Click. Okay. Man, if I get this top of this and that picture, it's going to be a miracle. Click. Okay, Tony, during this pan, I've moved about 2 feet downslope, so I don't know if things are going to match up too well or not.
We'll make it work.
And if both the film and camera had problems with heat and cold, then how did the astronauts themselves stay cool? It was the job of the life support system, the PLIS, to regulate the body temperatures. How did that backpack actually keep an astronaut cool and likewise warm when they were working in the cold of the shadow areas?
Somehow they would have to radiate the heat away, and that's not an easy task because the rate that heat is radiated away goes up according to the 4th power of the temperature difference between the radiator and the surrounding medium. So you have to have a pretty hot radiator to radiate away a substantial amount of heat. It would be more likely that you would eject steam, because in taking the heat away from the astronaut, that heat would be used to heat water up and produce steam. So you should see venting of steam if they're using water for this purpose, rather than ice, actually.
We never once saw any ice crystals or indeed steam emanating from the vicinity of any astronaut, either spasmodically or on a regular basis. Not one piece of TV coverage demonstrates such an effect. Interestingly, many researchers, including Ralph Rene, also seriously doubt whether the PLIS had enough capacity for the job in the first place. In this part of the program, we've looked at the dangers of radiation and the serious problems to have been overcome on any journey to and from the moon. Clearly, in the 1960s, no one had the ability to deliver a guarantee against astronauts dying in space. This reason alone would have been sufficient motive for the falsification of what really happened during Apollo. We now come to one of NASA's biggest headaches: how to get the astronauts and their gear up and out into deep space in the first place. This segment of our program is the story of the Saturn V and those people who were behind the development of space rocket technology. Werner von Braun was to become one of the Nazis' chief rocket engineers, and together with Walter Dornberger of the German army and another older and more experienced rocket scientist, Hermann Oberth, they would develop the rockets deployed during the Second World War. But before that could happen, Hitler needed to be persuaded that the path-marked rocket development was the correct way to go and a worthwhile investment. All of which takes us back to 1927, when Werner von Braun was just starting out in his career, and Hermann Oberth was working on an extremely interesting project which surprisingly would become as relevant to the Apollo program as would the V2.
In the late 1920s, Hermann Oberth was invited to work on the German production Frau im Mond, Woman in the Moon. It was a Fritz Lang film, with a script credited to Lang's wife, Theo von Harbu. Frau im Mond was a silent movie with its plot based on manned flight to the moon. Oberth was responsible to Fritz Lang for the rocket design and flight details. It would appear that NASA has followed the principal elements of this virtual blueprint ever since. Just as NASA does today, using its Call of Air. The Soviets, however, preferred to construct their rockets horizontally and then deliver them horizontally to the launch pad, as the Russians still do today. No doubt they recognized that moving a high center of gravity rocket vertically was contrary to common sense. And contrary to some received opinion in the West, the Soviets have in fact always been the world's leaders in rocket development. With 21 firsts in space exploration, they had no need to present the world with rampant virility symbols for their journeys into space. As for NASA's Apollo launcher, the Saturn V, that rocket may not have been as great as it looked. To emphasize the moment before liftoff, Fritz Lang created the 10-9-8 countdown. It was one of the movie's most dramatic features. Lang had intended this countdown procedure merely to increase the dramatic tension at the launch. Lang said that NASA had incorporated another of his damn touches into its space dramas. Lang's actors were strapped to their couches, just as NASA did with Apollo. When the rocket motor had burned for a specified duration, we see first and second stage separation, as was the case with the Saturn V. In order to prevent the occupants from floating around the cabin in microgravity, they used the very practical solution of foot grips. Later, NASA was to stick everything to the walls with Velcro tape. And this attractive and exotic demonstration of the way that water globules will float in microgravity has also become an industry standard. First visualized in the 1920s. And the lunar landscape as designed by Lang's artists, with a camera set up ready. This look, with its pointed rather than smooth mountains, was copied exactly by NASA space artists on the decals that depicted the individual Apollo lunar modules. As you can see, the Frau in Mon set matches the LEM 7 decal very closely. Remembering that LEM 7 was allocated to Apollo 13's dark moon trip, is it not significant that this decal is the only one of the Apollo LEM series which depicts a LEM actually sitting on a fake lunar surface?
So all of these NASA procedures had actually been foreseen by a movie director and his colleague in 1927, which is not altogether surprising when that movie director turns out to be the most influential filmmaker of his time and colleague of the most eminent rocket engineer of the 1920s. And since all of these individuals later turned up in America, Nazi scientists von Braun, Dornberger and Obert, who were employed by the American government, while Lang pursued his career in Hollywood, should we then be surprised that the same methodology appears to have re-emerged? Sometime between 1929 and 1933, Obert and von Braun produced a promotional movie designed to convince the German authorities of the viability of their rocket research program. They did this by intercutting film of their successful rocket tests together with actual scenes from Frau im Mond and presenting the finished product as total fact to Adolf Hitler. Greatly impressed, Hitler gave the order for their research to be funded virtually without restraints by bankrolling the development costs, which in turn were, of course, underwritten by the private financiers of the Third Reich. Hitler confirmed Walter Dornberger as the head of the German Army Weapons Department to oversee the project. Dornberger was to say to von Braun that they would all be in trouble if fiction did not soon become fact. A new site was soon secured for their expanding research, selected by von Braun on the advice of his mother. It had been a wild island used for duck shoots by the Prussian aristocracy, including von Braun's relations. The place was called Peenemünde. Dedicated assembly plant, fuel storage and rocket launch facilities were constructed at Peenemünde. The Nazis co-opted thousands of personnel to work on this new technological development. But all new technology has to undergo many trials and tribulations before it can be successful, and Peenemünde was the site of much experimentation before these rockets were perfected and a successful launch achieved. New pieces of technology were developed, including gyroscopic control. Brand new rocket engines were developed and perfected. Success then followed. Von Braun presented film footage of the latest launch to Hitler. Significantly, this successful launch had a depiction of Frau im Mond on the side of the rocket.
At the end of the film, he abruptly said, we have something pretty formidable here, and ordered immediately the highest priority to put the thing into quantity production.
Unfortunately for the team, in April 1943, during full production of the V-2, Hitler, following his dreams and instincts, halted all rocket development. Desperate to fulfill their dream, the two most influential people at Peenemünde, Dornberger and von Braun, asked Albert Speer to set up a meeting. And it was in July 1943 at the Wolfslair, Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters, that von Braun showed Hitler models of proposed underground production facilities to inspire him to resume production. Hitler bought von Braun's idea that he could rocket bomb his way to victory through the production of hundreds of thousands of V-2 and V-3 rockets. The team was so successful in their presentation that the very next day, Hitler awarded a professorship to von Braun in recognition of his achievements. Werner von Braun considered manned spaceflight the goal of his life. This launch vehicle would become key to the means by which mankind would attempt to reach out into space, but for the Third Reich it was just a transporter of explosive, 1 ton per rocket, that would travel a distance of 200 miles before delivering its lethal burden without warning onto its target. By August 1943, SS Sturmbannführer von Braun, photographed here in uniform standing behind Himmler, had his underground facilities. Here in southern Bavaria, in the Mittelwerk, in appalling conditions, thousands of prisoners were used as slave laborers to manufacture the vast number of components required to fulfill the colossal production targets. These V-2s were transported to the French and Belgian coasts where the Nazis had set up launch pads for the rocket bombing of England and elsewhere. In the latter part of the war, over 2,000 V-2s rained down on London. A single V-2 delivered a great deal of damage. Despite the fact that the Allies attempted to destroy Peenemünde twice, it was essentially spared, and this was of course vital if the Allies were to recover the scientists and their essential technology. Notice the similarity in overall concept between the original V-2 engines and this, the much later Saturn V rocket motor. It's alleged that von Braun and his colleagues gave themselves up to the Americans, although the word rendezvous would appear to be nearer the mark. After various interrogations, or rather meetings, von Braun and his chosen band of rocketeers were escorted to America, where they were to become the backbone of the space program for several decades. Many other leading Nazi rocket engineers were assigned to the Soviet Union, and it is to misread history to imagine that the US gained the best of these engineers. Quite the contrary. The technicians, rockets and spare parts were divided up unequally between these two major powers. These operations, which had been planned for several years before the end of the war, were known as Overcast and Paperclip. How many British people knew or know even now that in the latter half of 1945 a prime cause of their recent misery, SS Sturmbannführer von Braun, had not only visited London, but had also been awarded an honorary fellowship by the British Interplanetary Society for his services to rocketry. The Soviets did not immediately repatriate their allotted portion of rocket engineers. They first worked with them on site in Germany and only subsequently moved everything, including personnel, back to the Soviet Union. Stalin fully supported the development of rocketry, and thanks to their methodology, the Soviets progressed faster in their understanding of the new rocket skills than did the United States. The Soviets milked their Germans dry of all knowledge, and by the 1950s the Soviet scientists knew as much, if not more, than their erstwhile teachers who were then repatriated to Germany. The Americans kept their rocket scientists permanently, played down their Nazi pasts, totally sanitized their records, and after some years granted them American citizenship. Research in the US progressed much more slowly than the development of rocket technology did in the Soviet Union.
Heading up the Soviet rocket program was a man in many ways very similar to von Braun, being a stickler for organization and a man of great vision. But where von Braun was merely an adequate engineer, and there were many men who were better than he, Sergei Korolev was a genius, the genius of all the rocket scientists. Korolev was responsible for the design of the rocket that launched the Sputnik, the world's first orbiting satellite. Unlike von Braun and overt spacecraft, Korolev's concepts appear to have been inspired by nature. His powerful launch rockets emulated the splayed bases that support the giant trees of our planet. Despite being divided into several research and development departments, each with their own head of operations, it would be Sergei Korolev who would hold the entire Soviet space program together until his untimely and unexpected death on the operating table in 1966. This is Korolev's home in Moscow. Here is his desk. And in the hall wardrobe, his hat, just as he left it before going to hospital that fateful day. In America, things weren't going too well. The film record explains why there were so many uncertainties in the US military with their homegrown rockets. Back in the USSR, shortly after Sputnik 1, Korolev was launching Laika, the dog, into space. However, the Soviets were learning to be economical with the truth concerning their activities in space. It was publicly announced that Laika died painlessly when her oxygen supply ran out.
It was many years later before it was revealed that in fact Laika had died a painful death, because the nose cone of the spacecraft ripped away as it reached Earth orbit, exposing the unprotected portion of Laika's cabin to the searing heat of the sun. But the further truth was that the nose cone had been designed to do exactly that. So, in the interest of learning how long a bioorganism could withstand such conditions, Laika had been knowingly destined for a painful death from the very start of the experiment, and the public were not to know what really happened until a comfortable time period had elapsed. If it has taken 30 years to get to the truth about a dog, how many more years will it take before the truth about the Apollo space program is allowed to seep into public consciousness concerning the fate of this planet's surrogate Apollo astronauts?
The go-ahead for manned flight had been given to Korolev at the end of 1960, and so he prepared his cosmonauts for the first manned orbit of Earth. At the climax of these preparations, the world was to see the images of a smiling young Yuri Gagarin boarding the bus that took him to the launch site, accompanied by his backup cosmonaut and staff from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. History in the making, for we were under the impression that these were news images from the Soviet Union, and we didn't question the fact. Why should we? The Soviet Union would enjoy beating the USA into space, and therefore we were absolutely certain that these events were and are recorded for posterity as they happened. Well, that turned out not to be the case.
Our research has found that few of the film images of Gagarin's space trip were shot at the time. It seems they were pre-filmed during several different sessions over an extended period. These images were then subsequently assembled and then edited to produce a final result. Certainly not true news gathering. That would explain, for example, the continuity errors in the bus sequence. Gagarin is embraced by key individuals, including Korolev himself. But new information reveals that most of this footage was not shot on the day of the launch. gallantly waving, Gagarin enters the elevator to ascend to the rocket launcher and the Vostok capsule. We then see Gagarin getting into the small capsule and sitting inside the sphere that was to be his home for this highly significant moment in history. The lighting, though, gives away the fact that this was all staged. Here we can see the cosmonaut sitting in his seat, but there are two shadows, one on each side of his head, indicating that lighting was used from two light sources placed either side of the camera. The top view shows that there was no lighting inside the capsule itself. Nor was there any room inside the small space for the camera and lighting rigs required. So how can there possibly be a view of Gagarin taken from the front rather than just from behind his head? We must emphasize that there was no space for another person, camera or lights inside this miniature capsule. This shot alone demonstrates that he was filmed from a cutaway setup, on another occasion, in another place, in a studio environment.
Details that have now come to light record that during the launch countdown, two awkward moments occurred. During the first of these, Korolev told the crew on the gantry that the hatch had not closed properly. This was news to them, as they had closed down all the bolts and no signals had activated to indicate any failure of procedure. Korolev insisted that the hatch be fully reopened and then rebolted, a task which added another 30 to 40 minutes to the countdown. Korolev also insisted that he alone would inform Gagarin of the delay. In fact, Korolev forbade the crew from speaking to the cosmonaut, who was supposedly listening to music inside the capsule. In so doing, he gave himself the opportunity to instruct Gagarin to leave, yes, leave the Vostok capsule. The second awkward moment occurred during this rebolting procedure, when the gantry began to swing away from the side of the rocket as if the countdown had not been halted. Obviously, the head of operations inside the launch bunker hadn't been apprised of the situation. About to fall off their lofty perch, the gantry crew hurriedly telephoned the launch bunker and asked them to return the gantry to the rocket's side, allowing them to complete their task.
So who was head of operations in the launch bunker?
Well, actually, it was Sergei Korolev, and he was totally aware of the timing of the countdown, since it was he who was responsible for the delay in the first place.
So why go to the trouble of creating this gantry incident?
We suggest it was a diversionary tactic, resulting in any observer taking their eye off the ball for a few vital minutes. This would ensure that the first publicized manned flight into orbit would not be compromised by a dead cosmonaut, and it would have served to cover the moment when Gagarin was removed from the capsule, and ultimately it would keep Korolev's research and development team ahead of their serious competition within the Soviet Union's internal space race. Was Gagarin removed and then replaced by a surrogate cosmonaut, or did the Vostok capsule go aloft with only a tape machine aboard? A technique that the Soviets had already honed to perfection, and they had already acclimatized Western listeners to the idea that human voices emanated from probes officially classed as unmanned. But that's another story. This Vostok capsule landed on a designated site well away from the public gaze. In the meantime, Gagarin had apparently ejected himself from the capsule and landed well over a mile away. However, his method of landing was kept very quiet, creating confusion in the history books for years to come. The Soviets wanted to claim a flight record, and, according to aeronautical rules, not astronautical, ejecting or bailing out would disqualify the entire flight, so the pilot had to land within his craft.
Astronaut substitution would have meant that the number of people on the gantry platform would have increased or decreased between securing the hatch for the first time and the actual launch. Was this the case?
Oh, yes, it was. It took 5 people to seal the hatch and check the procedures first time around, but at the second resealing, only 3 people were employed on this task. There was motive, opportunity, and time to accomplish the sleight-of-hand maneuver. And if such a tactic would ensure that the Soviet space program and their cosmonauts were kept alive, then it was worth the candle.
Lord Bruce Gardine was at that time a journalist with the London Financial Times, and until his death expressed grave doubts about the validity of the Gagarin flight. Throughout the spring of '61 he'd been in the Soviet Union and was in Moscow alive with rumours about this event from April the 6th until his departure. On his way to the airport on April the 11th, he was informed by his very well-connected minder that according to his sources the flight had already taken place that morning. The source of this information had been none other than the chairman of the Soviet Committee of Sciences. Bruce Gardine, travelling in Germany the following day, was then very surprised to hear the Gagarin flight being announced live over the East Berlin Airport tannoy system. Back in England, Jock Bruce Gardine established that NASA initially denied all knowledge of the Gagarin flight on the 12th. This statement was later corrected by the White House. But were the Americans in fact fully aware that the Soviets did not launch a craft on that day, April the 12th? No one's denying that the Soviet Union put the first man in space, but was that man's name Yuri Gagarin?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The Apollo project was in part a Cold War exercise. It was about competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. Kennedy wanted people to get to the moon before the end of the 1960s in order to beat the Soviet Union. Or at least this was part of it. One part of it had this foreign policy objective. The Soviet Union, therefore, had a very strong incentive to discover if this was being faked, because that would have been a huge propaganda coup. And given the espionage capability and the propaganda machine of the Soviet Union as it then was, the idea that the faking of the Apollo project would have escaped their notice also seems completely implausible.
Is this business of faking news events new? No, not at all, as we saw earlier with the Lusitania disaster. Previous to that event in 1906, footage of the actual San Francisco earthquake was also faked. And this totally fabricated film material outsold pictures of the real thing, which only showed the aftermath of the earthquake.
If fakery is offered as the real thing, then where is the line drawn between falsifying a few images and organising a fake, safe version of the entire event?
But at least the Soviets did have the ability to launch a capsule into space. Back in the US, all kinds of things were going wrong with the genesis of the Saturn V rocket.
It would have taken an F-1 to get the Saturn V off if it were fully loaded. But knowing the records that were made of F-1 failures, and particularly something known as combustion instability, which was a problem right up to the end, rocket engines have a great failing. In other words, waves can be set up in the jet that cause a perturbation that rockets back and forth inside the engine and destroys it. And I personally saw rocket engines destroyed in that way. The B-1 engine would have been much more reliable because it was a lower thrust.
What observations does Bill Wood have concerning the Saturn V?
For the first 8 feet past the end of the exhaust nozzle of these F-1 engines, the exhaust is black. It's not glowing. It's a black exhaust. Just as if you were to have some type of a shroud around the end of the engine with maybe kerosene being injected into the exhaust, so that when the smaller engine fires down the center of this, it ingests air from the inside the engine compartment down through the nozzle and mixes it with this injected kerosene. And it taking about 8 feet for this heated kerosene to mix with air before it catches on fire behind the engine. And that seems to produce this 800-foot long fuel-rich flame that is flapping in the air behind the Saturn V. The flame behind the Saturn V doesn't look very much like the flames behind other rockets using the same propellants. There's no normal mode of operation that would cause an engine like that to produce this dark zone. To do that, it would have to be running so fuel-rich that it would be so inefficient that it couldn't possibly produce the performance that was claimed for it. It's possible that they never really did solve the combustion efficiency problem with the F1 engine, and they decided that just for show purposes they would produce an engine that produced a giant flame, sort of like a huge flamethrower. And we all know that flamethrowers don't produce very much thrust.
As for their lunar lander, the Soviets designed a spherical module with 4 legs. The Americans also adopted a 4-legged lander, but finally agreed upon an angular, tent-like craft. Basically, this was an arrangement of 2 engines stacked one on top of the other, with additional functions assigned to the angular spaces of the vehicle. The lower half of this ungainly but appealing craft contained the descent engine, and after the moonwalks, this would become the launch pad for the upper part that contained the ascent engine. The pressurized crew cabin was arranged around the ascent engine housing, and the fuel tanks and equipment storage were located around that.
The LEM proposal was amazingly short. This was a 110-page document where Grumman proposed the entire LEM program, which is a $6.9 billion program. And that's an outrageously small document for anyone to submit and ask for $6.9 billion. There's no way that a reviewer could determine whether or not the contractor is going to accomplish anything worthwhile based on 110 pages of documentation for that size program. When I checked into 10 other programs of similar size, like the C-5A and large submarine orders or aircraft carrier orders, this type of thing, all of the proposals were between 5,000 pages and 86,000 pages, with an average of 38,000 pages. And yet we see this one standing there all by itself at 110 pages. And it appeared to me that this may have been a situation where they knew that if anyone checked, someone would say, well, in order to win this, you had to submit a proposal, right? So let me see the proposal. So they had to produce a proposal, but they didn't go to the trouble of producing one of decent length. A 110-page proposal is about appropriate for a $1.4 million program, which is 5,000 times smaller than the claimed LEM program. Now, you wouldn't need a very long proposal if you weren't really going to build a LEM that really had to work. If you were going to be building LEMs that ended up in museums or on displays, then you could probably do that for a few $1 million, and that might only require a 110-page proposal.
There were many problems for the engineers and astronauts during the development of the lunar module. On one occasion, Armstrong was nearly killed by the unpredictable trainer. After ejecting just in time, you can see Armstrong descending to safety. The LEM's rocket engines were designed to perform one-off vital tasks. The advantage of using the fuels chosen for the LEM, unlike any other alternatives, was that they could be stored without special cooling, and on firing should ignite instantly. When the descent or ascent engine was activated, instant combustion would have been a must, and the 2 engines had to perform without a single hitch.
The lunar lander descent engine, as well as the ascent engine, used a combination of hypergolic propellants, nitrogen tetroxide as the oxidizer, and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, or UDMH, as the fuel. Together they were known popularly as Aerozine 50. When they are mixed, they ignite spontaneously, and that's why they're called hypergolic propellants. After ignition, they produce a dark red opaque gas. We also have the Apollo footage showing, for example, the ascent engine lifting off and being followed up by a camera, and no exhaust gas showing. The exhaust jet coming out of the ascent or descent engine should be a tremendous cloud of dark red opaque gas which spreads out almost level with the tip of the rocket nozzle due to the vacuum on the moon. So that means it would have created an enormous cloud of gas, possibly even visible from Earth, but that's sort of a side issue. So that's what viewers should have seen when the ascent module took off. They should have seen a very large dark cloud.
All that is visible at the commencement of the LEM's ascent is not an exhaust, but only the bursting apart of the mylar covering. George Pinter worked for Grumman Aerospace on the LEM and was most actively involved at top level with the development of major LEM systems, especially the supercritical helium supply. His responsibilities involved not only the technical supervision of specialists, but also the overall management of the project. He was a recipient of an Apollo Achievement Award from NASA, especially in relation to his contribution to the Apollo 13 space rescue mission. George was so valuable to the creation of the LEM's engines that he was seconded to Rocketdyne for a brief period during their research into propulsion systems for the descent engine. George Pinter has stated that it was imperative that the astronauts were able to see when landing their LEM. So we have to ask, how did they accomplish that vital task when clouds of dense opaque smoke and dust were surrounding the craft and obscuring the astronauts' view?
Remember how the Apollo 11 crew were seeing their way to the surface, only picking up a little dust, according to Armstrong. It is not widely known that the maneuvering jets of the space shuttle also use hypergolics, and this exhaust is very clearly visible when these thrusters are fired. And as for not having any effect on the lunar surface, either melting it or blowing vast clouds of dust away, let alone generating a crater where they landed, well, here we can see that there is no disturbance whatsoever under the LEM, a fact, incidentally, that nearly all the crews felt obliged to draw our attention to.
It's just like Neil. I didn't dig any crater at all. Look at the descent engine. I didn't even dig a hole.
Prior to 1969, all NASA's artists depicted the LEM's exhaust smoke flaring out from beneath the LEM, whether it was red smoke or white smoke. But current, post-Apollo space film artists now depict simulations of the exhaust from the rocket engine coloured blue. Playing safe, surely. For George Pinter of Grumman, exhaust smoke would have to have accompanied the real landing and takeoff. But because the astronauts had to see to land, how could there possibly be any dense, opaque smoke of any colour? Remembering the 10,000 pounds of throttleable thrust burning at up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, not only should the LEM have generated a crater beneath the craft on landing, but for Apollo 11 at least, surely there should have been a trail of molten dust behind it as the craft travelled over the lunar surface on its overshoot to the final landing site. This is volcanic rock on Mount Etna, which was made molten by heat of only 1,000 degrees Celsius before solidifying.
What happened to all the dust that was kicked up by the engine? Why didn't it fill up the landing pads? Why didn't it cloud to the point where you couldn't see anything? They probably reasoned it this way, that if we create a crater, we're going to create more questions, more problems. Let's just say that the exhaust nozzle, because it was operating in a vacuum, was dispersed over a wide area, and that it really didn't have the strength to create a crater. Well, that's not true, because the main jet coming down still had to support 2,300 pounds of lunar lander in a lunar gravity, 1/6 of Earth. It had to support that. Obviously, the power had to be centralized, not spread out in a vacuum over, say, a 50-foot diameter circle. The jet from a rocket engine will move large boulders as though they were being shot out of a cannon.
Here is a more recent event that occurred in the mid-1990s with the DCX rocket.
The DCX dug up the prepared site so badly it dug a crater 2 feet deep while it was landing on compacted gypsum. And it tore that up in big chunks of this gypsum broke loose and were pelting the outside of the craft, which was a lot beefier than the outside of the LEM. And finally, the last time they flew it, it did tip over because one of the 4 landing legs didn't come down. Of course, that would happen in 1995, but it would never happen in 6 Apollo missions, right, on the moon.
So, there are many reasons to question the Apollo imagery relating to the claimed landings and takeoffs from the lunar surface. If these moon landing images were faked, then how did we manage to acquire so many rocks? Core samples and lunar dust have been obtained by unmanned probes. The Soviets were particularly advanced in this technology, but there were supposedly many samples loaded onto LEMs and returned to Earth.
The claim is that the Apollo program collected hundreds of pounds of lunar rocks, something like 750 pounds, some large amount of lunar rocks in the 6 missions. And I think that only a few pounds were actually collected remotely by ourselves and in a similar manner by the Russians, because we had an agreement before we went to the moon to trade lunar soil samples. We would trade soil from the sites that we visited, and they would trade samples from the sites that their robot craft visited and compare them. And then I think the vast majority of the hundreds of pounds of moon rocks that we claim to have are made here on Earth, and that's why they look so similar to Earth rocks. That's why they found that the composition is so similar. They can be irradiated or exposed to a vacuum or modified in certain minor ways so that they appear slightly different, and then they do an analysis and say, well, it's just like Earth rocks except for these few minor changes. And then they hypothesize that they were blasted by meteorites. Well, they can be blasted by meteorites artificially.
Paul Jacobs was a top investigator in San Francisco. I went to see him to get his help. I said, Paul, help me with my Apollo hoax project. He says, all right, I will. I'm flying to Washington next week. I'll go see the head of the U.S. Department of Geology. And he did. And he asked the geologist, did you examine the moon rocks? Did they really come from the moon? The geologist just laughed. Well, there's a sad ending to this story. Paul flew back from Washington. I met with him again in San Francisco, and he told me what he had determined, that the Apollo project was a hoax and that people at high levels were keeping it a secret. Unfortunately, Paul and his wife died of cancer within 90 days. Lee Galvani. He's been in touch with me for many, many years, and he says that he had almost convinced James Irwin to confess and clear his conscience of this terrible burden. And curiously and appropriately, James Irwin called me at my home here in SoCal and wanted me to call him back. But he was dead of a heart attack in 3 days. Ignition and liftoff.
If the Saturn V was such a good launch vehicle, why was it dropped after the last Apollo mission to be replaced by the space shuttle? Why was a new launcher required when NASA supposedly had a tried and tested powerful rocket in the form of the Saturn V?
The shuttle weighs about 3/4 as much as the Saturn V, and it only puts about 1/6 as much weight into orbit, and it costs about 3 times as much as the Saturn V to launch. It was first flown 2 years behind schedule, and it's cost a lot more than the Saturn V to develop. So in almost every measure of rocket technology, the shuttle is greatly inferior to the claimed performance of the Saturn V.
Seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
if the Saturn V had worked, far and away the most logical thing to do with that hardware that was developed with billions and billions of dollars was to begin producing them, because then the development cost gets amortized over the cost of all of the produced vehicles, and use it to launch the shuttle. If they wanted to actually have an airplane that goes into orbit, they could have put a shuttle orbiter on top of the second stage of the Saturn V and flown the whole thing into orbit. The first stage would have dropped into the ocean like it normally does, and the second stage and the fully loaded shuttle orbiter would have made it into low Earth orbit. Now those second stages could have been assembled in orbit to form a space station. We could have had the first launch of the shuttle about 5 years sooner at a savings of about $20 billion. And by the time the shuttle was actually launched in 1981, we could have had the beginnings of a manned space station in orbit. If in fact their claimed performance was a hoax, then there's no reason to continue making any more of them. And that's why you might want to start all over and develop something from scratch that is actually going to work, even if it only puts up 1/6 as much payload and costs 3 times as much per launch.
It is a little-known fact outside the industry that the space shuttle is a vastly inefficient rocket. The allegedly recoverable boosters are more often lost at the bottom of the sea than they are recovered for reuse, which together with other issues minimizes the claims for an economical recyclable spacecraft. One of the many reasons why replacement technology is being developed, for example the Lockheed Martin X-33 shuttle. Was there ever really a space race in the true sense of the word?
If we were racing the Russians to the moon, and if we beat them, why didn't they do it the next year, or 5 years later, or 10 years later, or even 25 years later? Why didn't they ever do it? And usually the response is, well, they got so discouraged because we beat them to the moon that they gave up. Well, if that were true, then why didn't we give up when they beat us with the first satellite into orbit, or the first man, or the first woman, or the first space station? Why did we keep struggling with them the whole time, and why the very first time we beat them in something major did they give up? And why did they give up so thoroughly that they never went at all?
Of course, we know at a very high level the Russians and the Americans have been in bed together for a long time. I mean, the Russian Revolution was financed by Wall Street. I mean, this is known.
Beginning October 18, Soviet cosmonauts Andrei Nikolaev and Vitaly Sevastyanov toured the U.S. and several NASA field centers. During that same month, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to study ways that American and Russian spaceships could meet and join in space. During his visit to Russia, President Nixon signed an agreement with Chairman Kosygin of the USSR to conduct an Earth orbital rendezvous and docking in 1975 between a U.S. and a Russian spacecraft. Engineers from both countries have already begun working out the details of the mission. American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts trained this year to prepare for a joint space mission in 1975. The two crews will meet and join their spacecraft while in orbit around the Earth. Beyond the rescue capability they will demonstrate, it is hoped the complex project will lead to future international cooperative programs.
They have sort of a tacit agreement that we won't blow the whistle on you if you won't blow the whistle on us. Simple. That's what I've often said on radio and television when they say, well, how come the Russians, if they knew that we didn't go to the moon, how come they didn't say anything? Well, it's better that they don't say anything.
It's highly likely that only a few individuals were privy to the whole plan. As with the Manhattan Project, which involved hundreds of thousands of people working across America on the development of the United States atomic bomb, only a relatively small group of scientists were aware of the actual agenda behind the work they were doing, and even fewer masterminds were coordinating the whole program. So in a similar way, this assault on space involved hundreds of thousands of people working towards, in their understanding, a race against the Soviets to reach the moon first.
No doubt when it was understood that it was going to be well nigh impossible to do the job safely with the available technology, only relatively few of the core teams would have been completely in on the alternative plan to fake the public record of the Apollo moon landings. This would become the cover for the surrogate program. Even fewer key individuals would have been in on the reasons behind the top-secret scheme to get out into space at all costs. And with that in mind, we propose that the Soviets and the Americans were at the highest level always working together on this planet's space program right from the start, and that the split of the Nazi rocket scientists into two teams, destined for America and the then Soviet Union, was part of a well-thought-out plan up and running before the end of World War II.
A key step in any space program would be the establishment of communication satellites in geosynchronous orbit around the Earth. This network of communications and spy satellites would also achieve the aim of the space program as set out by Lyndon Johnson. He said,
"Control of space means control of the world. From space, the masters of infinity would have the power to control the Earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change the climates to frigid. There is something more important than the ultimate weapon, and that is the ultimate position, the position of total control over Earth that lies somewhere in outer space."
It's entirely possible that there was always going to be a two-pronged program for landing on the moon, one executed in secret and the other played out in public. However, both the American and Soviet teams, in the end, were at the mercy of radiation, the biggest showstopper in deep space exploration to this day.
Back in the 1960s, there was no doubt that those who were in control of space were controlling the information that encircled the planet. So how did they manage to overcome the technical problems inherent in pulling off the faking of the live TV coverage of Apollo?
I think probably the most logical way would be to beam signals to the moon and have a amplifier and repeater on the moon that would then amplify and repeat these signals and beam them back. That way anyone who had a proper antenna pointed at the moon could plainly see that they were getting signals from the moon. They just wouldn't know that those signals were bouncing back.
The Soviets had developed a very satisfactory roving vehicle, guided from Earth, called the Lunar. Lunar was landed successfully on the lunar surface and travelled over considerable distances. It had the capabilities of soil and rock sampling and was equipped with TV cameras and a laser reflector. These items had dust covers that could protect the lens and prisms respectively. The laser reflector was useful for receiving a laser beam from Earth in order to measure the precise Earth-Moon distance at any given moment in time.
One craft could have performed all of the functions that would simulate the lunar landing. It could land on the moon with its repeater, and this craft could also place a transmitting seismometer into the lunar soil that could continue to transmit back lunar quakes, which we received for quite some time. This same device could also pop out a laser reflector onto the moon's surface, and it could perform all of these functions. It could also have lowered a drill into the lunar soil and dug up lunar soil, and then the return craft, unmanned, could bring that soil back to Earth.
There really isn't a case to answer. The Apollo project had to have happened in order to produce this data, and if it hadn't happened, it would have been impossible to cover up for this length of time.
But people have been whistleblowing for many years now. In this program, we've looked very carefully at evidence which clearly indicates that NASA hoaxed and faked the Apollo record. We've looked closely at many still photographs that are seen together on one continuous roll of film where there was no scope for retouching or the insertion of promotion pictures. And we have looked at the TV coverage as well. In addition to the attempted confession by James Irwin, there's a more recent statement from an Apollo insider. In September 1999, it was reported by journalist Graham Birdsall that at the first Pacific UFO conference in Hawaii, The astronaut Brian O'Leary, who worked alongside the likes of Armstrong and Aldrin for many years, commented,
"If some of the film was spoiled, it's remotely possible they may have shot some scenes in a studio environment to avoid embarrassment."
For an insider to consider this faking a possibility is quite remarkable. When that individual worked for NASA in the 1960s, and specifically on the Apollo 11 mission during 67 and 68, this really is some statement. But the view that the still photographs have been faked, whereas the TV transmissions remain genuine just because they were live, is unacceptable. Both the TV and the still photographs were imaged in the same settings. One single contradictory example would be enough to demonstrate that there is a problem with the integrity of the material published by NASA. You've seen many such examples in this program and much else besides. The lack of continuity between the stills and TV coverage of the same events, the whistleblowing inherent in the lighting of these images, the totally faked setups, the clues in the dialogue of the astronauts returning to mission control, and the serious problems associated with radiation and the technology. All these matters underline one simple fact. A representative of humanity may well have gone to the moon in 1969, but the images published by NASA of a manned lunar landing are not the true and accurate record of such an event. Bill Kaysing has been in contact with an electronics technician who's spoken out. He was part of the team at the Goldstone Tracking Station, California, during Apollo.
He strongly suspected that Apollo was being faked, that the information coming in was not coming from a genuine command capsule. It was coming from a satellite that was transmitting the information as though it were coming from the moon.
My integrity is insulted by these setups, these fakes, and I feel very strongly that it's time that these matters were brought to public light, were exposed, so that we can each and all of us understand as though we are human beings and not a sub-race governed by an elite who choose what we shall see and not see. This, as far as I'm concerned, is censorship of the very worst form.
But if, as NASA wishes to imply, if we were so successful at getting to the moon in the 1960s, and if we had already developed the principal technology to do so, and setting aside the purely scientific exploration of the moon, then why hasn't NASA practiced elements of their proposed manned Martian voyage out, around, and on the moon? What was the prognosis for manned space travel beyond a low Earth orbit after the days of Apollo? The RIDE report goes a long way to answering that question.
This report was written by a team that was chaired by Sally Ride, former shuttle astronaut, and they speculated in this report that if NASA were fully funded on a mission to send men back to the moon, that they could, if they spent billions of dollars a year starting in 1987, that they would be able to, they estimated they'd be able to first land men on the moon by the year 2010, which would mean 23 years to land men on the moon for the next time. And the question being, since it only supposedly took 8 years from Kennedy's announcement until Apollo 11, why would it take so much longer and cost so much more money to do it for the 7th time than it did to do it for the first 6 times?
However, this stated time period was to increase fourfold. In 1999, Douglas Cook, director of the Exploration Office at Houston's Johnson Space Center, said that his primary objective for future travel to the moon was to be able to test his hardware there, in readiness for a trip to Mars. Cook believes that humans will actually return to the moon within 100 years.
In the late 90s, the UN terminated weapons inspections in Iraq. In 1999, a BBC Panorama documentary demonstrated that the CIA had run an unauthorized eavesdropping operation against the Iraqis from UNSCOM's office in Baghdad, and that the British and the Americans hid behind the United Nations to run this spy operation from headquarters in Bahrain. It appears, though, that instead of just looking for weapons of mass destruction, they, UNSCOM, were, without the mandate of the United Nations, actually spying. Therefore, it was a United States, not a UN operation. So it would appear that the United States and UNSCOM claimed they were doing one thing, when in effect they were also doing something else. Now, this tactic is by no means new. Here, with the UNSCOM operation, are parallels with what we maintained happened during Project Apollo, 30 years previously.
From the sheer weight of evidence, the firm conclusion of this investigation has to be that in the case of Apollo, NASA stated that the agency was doing things one way, when in fact a hidden surrogate program proceeded in a very different manner. The total costs of Project Apollo, together with the Soviet part of the program, were estimated to be at least $30 to $40 billion on each side. Now, given this cost, it's perhaps understandable that what we were shown was done so as to avoid the risk of these huge levels of funding not being made available in the first place, and much illusion, including the space race itself, had to be maintained to keep the funds flowing. But what this investment did bring was ownership of the true experiences encountered by any surrogate astronauts regarding the actual conditions on and around the moon. The rest of the world were never to know what motives really lay behind the first ever manned deep space program. Bennett and Percy, the authors of Dark Moon, propose that our planet's basic technology for space travel needs radical conceptual renewal, the development of a totally new form of space travel. And rather than sliding around on the surface of space, mankind needs to create a technology that enables us to travel through space within realistic time frames and without unduly endangering our astronauts. As they say, it's no longer acceptable to be economical with the truth in order to cover a hidden agenda. As ordinary citizens, we do not expect our space experts to know everything, nor should we hold today's people at NASA responsible for their predecessors' decisions, unless they wish to maintain the myth of Apollo in the face of the overwhelming new evidence. In that case, they will be as guilty as these first decision makers. Moreover, incapable of fulfilling their desire to travel out into the solar system, these frustrated masters of infinity will then be bent on shoring up the edge of darkness, low Earth orbit with space stations and so-called Star Wars technology. During the 1986 Presidential Commission on the Shuttle Challenger disaster, the eminent physicist Richard Feynman found that NASA's analysis, claims and methodology were consistently incorrect. Feynman said,
NASA owes it to the citizens from whom it asks support to be frank, honest and informative. And so that these citizens can make the wisest decisions for the use of their limited resources for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations. For nature cannot be fooled.
If you have an unlimited budget, which is what the simulators had, you can do anything you want. You can create the most incredible vistas, people on Mars or Venus or planets of the nearest star. Money will buy anything, except happiness.